Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the third part of WhatIf Deku was the Grim Reaper. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Midoriya stayed quiet as Aizawa argued with Nezu, who just seemed to be enjoying the situation. He hadn't moved from his spot on the hospital bed. Recovery girl wasn't making eye contact with him anymore and had simply moved to her desk. Kami floated over to sit next to him, but after deeming his form too unstable to make contact with the bed, he just stood by the boy. His successor hadn't moved a muscle since the principal's declaration, and that concerned the ghost. "Are you doing all right?" He didn't respond. The teachers just kept fighting. Is it because of Eraserhead's reaction? Again, no response. Is it the change then? Is it because you are being forced somewhere new? No answer. Was it just the day? Has today been too much? Nothing. The teen wasn't sure what was wrong with him, honestly. It just felt like the air had been pulled from his lungs, like he was gasping on nothingness. He felt empty and alone, despite the yelling in the room and the words coming from his mentor. He wasn't sure if going home was what he wanted, but at the same time, he wasn't sure if going with Aizawa was what he wanted either. I mean, it was obvious that the man wasn't jumping for joy either. He didn't want to cause any more problems for anyone, but was that worth going back home? He really didn't know. Midoriya. The boy jumped a bit, startled at the call, but otherwise made no effort to respond. Once he realized it was the principal calling him, he made a small hum of confirmation, but nothing more. Nezu figured he finally had the student's attention. Sorry about all of that. Aizawa-san is going to stay with me for a bit to finish the finalities. But don't worry, he's having Yamada-san pick you up. Midoriya's breath hitched at the name, the unfamiliarity sparking something like primal fear. His hand was halfway to his chest before he stopped it and moved it back to his side. Kami must have understood the same thing, as he took a threatening step towards the rodent. "Are you sure about this, sir?" he whispered. "I really don't want to be any trouble." The principal elbowed the tired man in the leg, but it wasn't caught by either of the deathly duo. Aizawa definitely did, on the other hand, and stifled a curse. "Trust me, Midoriya," he assured, "you're no trouble at all." The teen wasn't convinced, but he flashed a small smile anyway. He gripped his backpack straps tightly, digging his gloved fingers into the leather. He watched Nezu make a slight movement with his paw and took it as a gesture to stand up from the bed. He wobbled on his feet, but grabbed at the bed for balance. He was still suffering from lightheadedness due to Recovery Girl's quirk, but forced himself to stand nonetheless. Then there was a knock on the door. "Oh, that must be Yamada-san now," Nezu exclaimed, clapping his paws together. "Come in." Midoriya didn't really know who this Yamada was, but he picked up some important tidbits about the person. 1. Aizawa knew Yamada on some sort of personal level and probably trusted him. Even if the hero was making it blatantly obvious that he wasn't looking forward to fostering him, he knew the man's rational mind wouldn't allow him to do things half-assed. So if the man was truly having someone else pick him up, he wouldn't have just chosen someone randomly. 2. Yamada must work at UA. To have arrived at the nurse's office so quickly, it was likely the man was a hero, and subsequently a teacher. Most of his current teachers hadn't introduced themselves yet, so he was stuck calling them by their hero names. Yamada could be one of his teachers then. Or maybe he was a teacher he didn't have, like a gen ed or a support course teacher. Of course, there was always the possibility that this mysterious man wasn't a teacher at all. But other than that, he really knew nothing about the man. So imagine the boy's surprise when he watched Present Mike, his English teacher, walk into the room. "Hey Sho, you needed something?" the loud man asked cheerily. The teacher stopped right at the doorway, realizing the awkwardness of the situation. Aizawa stared at him blankly, while Nezu stood by his feet and waved. Recovery Girl had moved away to her desk a while back, and just seemed to be ignoring the situation. Midoriya reacted, though it was only his gaze, and Kami turned his whole form to now face the door. "I'm sure you both already know each other," the principal started. "But anyway, Yamada-san, this is Midoriya Izuku from the hero course." "Midoriya, this is Yamada, but you probably know him better as Present Mike." The newly introduced teacher chuckled awkwardly. "Well, hello little listener. Just like the principal said, I'm Yamada Hisashi." The teen gulped quietly, not knowing what to say. "I apologize for having Aizawa-san call you here on such short notice," Nezu continued, "but I'm afraid it's pretty important." Yamada grew serious. "It's no problem at all." "What is it?" The rodent gestured for the student to come closer, so he did, walking over to stand beside Nezu and in front of his English teacher. His mind was racing, and yet his throat felt like a desert. Was he going to be staying with Aizawa still? Or was Present Mike picking him up so he could stay with him? What would happen to his mother, or his notebooks, or his plants? How long would this last? When would he have to find a new family? Well, Nezu smiled a wide and unnerving smile. one that shook the boy to his core. You and Aizawa-san will be fostering Midoriya for some time, so I need you to take him back to your apartment to get settled in. The teen deadpanned. The principal sure had a way of being straightforward. When Yamada told his husband that he wanted a child, this wasn't quite what he was expecting. Currently, the two had left the school and were walking down an empty street. The hero had changed out of his clothes to not draw attention, and combed his hair down from his signature look. His hands were stuffed in his leather jacket pockets and his jeans ruffled around in the breeze. And yet, as comfortable as he was, not a word had been uttered since they left the nurse's office. Midoriya walked next to him, eyes downcast and hands tightly wrapped around his backpack straps. He debated burrowing his fingers into the bottom of his uniform top, but decided against it to not make any more unnecessary wrinkles. His analytic mind was beaming at the thought of strolling beside a pro hero, but somber shadows quickly restrained his excitement and brought back the dread. He was pretty sure he was spiraling again, as the unwelcome feeling of drowning in agony returned, but there wasn't much he could do in the moment. He was positive the pro didn't know about his situation, and that was not a conversation he wanted to have in the moment. Kami simply floated behind the two silently, observing every step the hero took. His successor had first introduced him to this man back at the entrance exam briefing, and back then, he was sure the hero was only a loud and obnoxious individual. But now, he wasn't so sure. The silence must have gotten to the man, as he was used to naturally talking, so he finally spoke. So Midoriya, you want to tell me more about yourself? I've only known you since these first 2 days of school. Yamada knew he was a lot of things, but an idiot was not one of them. He had a good idea of what was going on. Yue didn't typically pull kids from their homes often, but it had happened enough that he understood the protocol. He knew that this student's home life must be bad enough for Nezu to act so quickly. But there was no way he was going to open a conversation asking this kid about home, especially in an area so public as this. And still, when the boy looked up at him to respond, his heartstrings were tugged violently. He looked so alone and unsure of himself. When he saw the kid in his class, he just chalked it up to being nervous or introverted. But now that he had a better idea of where his skittish behavior had come from, it tore apart his heart. The hero couldn't understand what would compel anyone to hurt a child like this, especially one as shy and sweet as Midoriya. The teen stuttered, trying to gather up the confidence to speak. I like analysis and gardening. The man leached onto that information, hoping to keep the boy talking. Oh, analysis. Do you analyze anything in particular? This wasn't Yamada's first time assisting Yue in a sensitive situation. He knew how to tread around topics that were sensitive and to encourage a student to talk about something they enjoyed. He'll like to think he was decent enough in handling children, though this was the first time he'd ever be fostering one. He watched the boy light up. To do quirk analysis. Most of my notes are on pro heroes, as since they're so easy to research. I wanted to write some notes on my classmates, but I'm afraid they'll think it's weird. The teacher was impressed. Have you analyzed any heroes here at UA? And why would they think it's weird? Midoriya felt the shadows loosen their hold and retreat, and his head clocked into overdrive. I've done pretty much all the heroes that work at UA. Hugh, Midnight, Cementos, even Aizawa-sensei. Then he grew nervous, and the brightness in his eyes dimmed. He fiddled with his gloves anxiously and took a second to breathe before continuing. Most people find it creepy that I observe them so closely. I think it freaks people out that I'm able to dissect their quirks and their weaknesses so quickly. Yamada hummed. Well, what have you done on me? If you don't mind me asking. Well, your quirk is voice, and it allows you to amplify the volume of your voice to do damage, but that's pretty obvious on its own. The teen paused to try and recall his notes to the fullest extent. By itself, it's a pretty basic quirk, but that allows a lot of room for creativity. He looked up to the man, almost waiting for confirmation to continue. The pro glanced down at him, tilting his glasses to his nose. He flashed a small smile and gave a slight nod, which provided just enough confidence for Midoriya to keep talking. You already have your directional speaker system for support, but that's barely the tip of the iceberg. Wait a minute, he interrupted. My directional speaker what? The student looked lost. The thing around your neck. He waved a finger to his own neck to emphasize. The hero laughed. Oh, so that's what that is called. The deathly duo shared a look of disbelief. Kami simply shrugged back, so the boy returned his gaze to the sidewalk in front of him. Well, considering your quirk, there are a lot of ways to give yourself advantages in combat. Creating echoes would be a great way to increase the volume and range of your quirk, and it would confuse villains as well. He stopped, raising a finger to his chin and thought, though, that would be difficult to achieve on your own. Pairing with Cementos would be ideal, but that's not exactly how it works during an emergency. Echoes, Yamada repeated. I've never thought of that. Midoriya must have not heard him, because he just kept rambling. While you do have support gear already, there's a lot of room to expand. Have you ever thought of smaller, long-range speakers? They can be connected to you by a wire so you can throw them out like a grenade. Then, all you have to do is yell into the existing system around your neck and the sound will be directed out to the mini speakers. The teen realized he had been talking for a while and looked up to his teacher to check in on him. The lost look on his face was all he needed to see to understand that he had been rambling again. Basically sound grenades, he re-explained, powered by your quirk. Though, he realized, that actually sounds pretty handy. He looked down bashfully at the praise, the fact that he had just been giving a pro hero support tips finally clicking in his head. Now that he was done talking, his consciousness started to creep back and made him feel unsure of himself once again. His mentor did his best to reassure him, but even the ghost's pats and hair ruffles weren't enough. Anyone who would think that's weird is insane. Yamada spoke up, interrupting his spiraling thoughts. Your analysis is really helpful. Midoriya did a double take. Oh, really? Yeah, the man exclaimed. Your outside analysis is super beneficial to anyone looking to expand on their quirk. Just makes me want to say yeah. The teen was about to respond when the loud man in front of him stopped suddenly, making him skid to a stop as well. Gami wasn't paying attention to either, and stumbled into his successor. The impact made him shift a few paces, but he corrected himself before his teacher could ask question. They had finally arrived at a small house, only a few blocks away from the school. It was an unassuming gray color, with few windows and a dark roof. Despite the boring colors, it felt actually quite welcoming, almost as if it was inviting him inside. There was a soft click, and then the front door swung open. The pro held it open with one extended arm, beckoning the student to walk inside. There was a slight moment of hesitation, but the home's ambient warmth soon engulfed him and he entered. He wiped his red sneakers off on the mat, but didn't know whether to take them off or not, so he waited until Yamada walked in as well and shut the door. The hero took off his shoes and left them on the side of the mat, so Midoriya did the same. His English teacher rushed off to the main hallway, so he took off after him. He wasn't sure where the man was headed. Maybe he should have stayed by the door until he got a direct command. This was our guest room, he suddenly explained, stopping at a door, but Kayama doesn't come over that often, so we don't really need it. He turned to look at the boy behind him, only to meet a confused expression. Ah, sorry, he sighed. I keep forgetting you don't know us by our names. Kayama is Midnight. Midoriya nodded. Gami grew closer to him. Seems like a lot of the teachers at UA have close relations. That was true. Present Mike seemed to be close to Aizawa in some way, and he also knew Midnight personally enough that she would come over. Who knows how long they had been friends? Maybe when they started their hero careers, maybe even earlier. I'm sure Sho won't mind this becoming your room. That short-circuited his brain in an instant. There was a lot to unpack in that one singular statement. He was getting his own room. Now, it wasn't like he hadn't had a bedroom before. He obviously had his own room living with his mother, but the room never really felt like it was his. It just felt like a mouse hole in the wall, and like he was a stowaway rat. Sure, it was his room, but it never really belonged to him. Second, and probably the most shocking, was what his teacher had implied when designating the guest room as his own. He figured that Sho was the man's nickname for Aizawa, based on the fact that he had addressed his homeroom teacher like that when entering the nurse's office. But bringing up the pro hero like that could only mean that this was Aizawa's home. This would have to be Eraserhead's house, or else it wouldn't matter what the tired teacher thought. And that brought up a whole new set of questions. Did that mean that present Mike was living with him? Were they roommates, in a relationship? Or was the loud hero not living here? Did he simply just have a spare key? Even if that was the case, that still meant that Aizawa trusted him a large deal to give someone a key to his home. Midoriya. Yamada's yelling jolted him out of his endless thoughts, and he blinked a few times to try and get his surroundings straight. He looked up in confusion, but that seemed to be enough for the man as he let out a sigh. I was just asking if this was all right for you, he restated. All right, that's what the hero was worried about. He had already given him residence in a new home and a new room to himself, and he was wondering if it was all right. If Midoriya truly had a say in things, he'd scream about how it wasn't all right. That someone like him really didn't deserve nice things like this when there were kids like Todoroki. He was doing fine on his own. After all, he'd practically been on his own for 11 years. His situation wasn't anything of worth compared to all the other kids he knew were suffering out there. And yet, the boy knew he didn't have a say. He never had a say in his life so far, so why should he expect one now? His life had been governed so meticulously by the adults around him, he never expected more. And as nice as his English teacher was to him, in the end, he was the adult. He had the control. It almost made him break into laughter that the man bothered asking the question in the first place. After all, it was obvious he didn't care about whatever Midoriya said in return. It was like how people always start a greeting by asking how you're doing. The answer really doesn't matter to them. It's just a matter of being polite. And everyone always says they're doing good in return, even if they aren't. because nobody cares about how you're doing, it's just how the formality goes. He personally wasn't sure if he would feel comfortable in a completely new room of a completely new house after his whole life had been pulled from under him, but who actually cared? Ooh, yeah, this is fine. That's just how the formality goes. The room was pretty barren, which made sense considering it was a guest bedroom in Eraserhead's house. It was of a fair size, with a large, gray queen-sized bed in the corner. There was a nightstand on the bed's free side, a boring, black desk, and nothing more. The only thing that had really excited Midoriya about the room, other than the spacious bed, was the beautiful window that stood right in front of the desk. It wasn't any different from a typical window, but the way it allowed the sunlight to flow into the room made everything feel so much brighter. Gami probably didn't like that though, so he'd have to get some curtains for it sometime. But the awe from the window only lasted a good half hour, at best. The room wasn't all that entertaining, and it wasn't like he had much to do. There wasn't much homework, since it was only the second day of school, and what there was he had already completed at lunch. He did have his phone and a quirk analysis notebook on him, but he couldn't bring himself to really use either. So he was simply sitting at the desk, flipping through his notebook for what was probably the millionth time. He wanted to lie on the bed, but he was still on his school clothes and really didn't want to make Aizawa or Yamada upset. He was a bit weary of sitting at the desk, but figured that if they walked in on him like that, it shouldn't bother them too much. Gami had tried to coax the teen out of the room, but his efforts were fruitless. Nothing he said or did could convince him to leave even the desk he was sitting at. Present Mike said this was his room, and that was his safe spot. He rarely ever was hurt in his room, and so that was where he felt the most comfortable. There was no telling what would happen to him if he left the room and went somewhere else. He had been listening closely, and hadn't heard the front door open, so that meant the hero was still in the house somewhere. What if the man caught him outside the room? He would most surely get upset, but the question was how upset? Upset enough to yell at him? Upset enough to punish him? Upset enough to take out his frustrations on him? There was no way he was leaving this room, not unless the house was empty or someone told him to. And Midoriya didn't care how long it took for one of those things to happen. He would be patient and he would wait. That was exactly how he survived with his mother for 11 years, after all. A sudden knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. He fumbled in the desk chair a bit, its wheels squeaking on the hardwood floor. The sound dropped his heart rate a few beats, and he hoped that it was too quiet to be heard. "Hey Midoriya," a soft voice came from just beyond the door. He instantly recognized it as his English teacher, and wondered why he hadn't just opened the door yet. "I'm going back to UA to see how Shou's doing. I won't be gone long." Why was he telling him this? What would it matter how long he would be gone? Was this just another formality thing? That had to be it. It was the responsible thing to do, to tell him he would be leaving. Of course, Yamada didn't care how he felt about being alone. "All right," he replied just as quietly. There was a bit of a difference though. Present Mike's voice sounded more of an unsure quiet, while his was a submissive quiet. Besides, he didn't have a problem with being left alone. In fact, he was waiting for this exact opportunity since he walked into the room. The boy wasn't sure how long he had been in the room, but based on the dim light coming in from the window, it had to have been a couple hours at least, and the slight rumbling from his stomach definitely tipped him off that it was getting late. The pro must have heard him, because he could hear the footsteps move away from his door and towards the front. The steps were distinct, echoing softly on the hardwood flooring. It sounded as if the hero wasn't wearing any shoes still. The teen felt the urge to walk up to his closed door, so he did, ever so quietly. He crept towards it and pressed his ear up against the wood. Gami followed him silently and stood at the wall next to the door. There, the two listened. They listened as the man approached the front door and the footsteps stopped. Midoriya took a shaky swallow. The feeling of déjà vu washed over him so heavily. He felt as if he'd drown in it. They listened, as both of them could make out the sound of shoes being slipped on and sliding against the doormat. The boy was positive the hero was putting on boots, specifically ones with hard soles, by the way they clicked against the floor. Maybe combat boots, maybe cowboy boots, he wasn't too sure on the type. They listened, as the jingle of house keys being taken off their hook pierced through the quiet air. That sound made him feel like throwing up. This felt so familiar, too familiar. His hands grew so cold and clammy. He wanted to tear his gloves off. Something was wrong. Wrong, wrong, wrong. He listened as the front door opened. The footsteps started up again. His heart pounded. He didn't realize he had left the safety of his room. Throwing open the door, he lunged for where he heard the footsteps roam moments before. "Dad, no," he cried desperately, tears clawing at the corner of his eyes. "Don't go." But the front door had already closed, Yamada long gone and unaware of the cries from the house behind him. Midoriya collapsed in the hallway, tears and sobs racking his entire body. His gloved fingers curled into his chest protectively, wringing his UA uniform into wrinkles. His breathing turned hysterical and unrestrained as Gami rushed to calm him. "Please, Dad," he called defeatedly. "Please don't go." The ghost wasn't sure what his successor was talking about. Your father isn't here, Izu. I'm sorry. He didn't seem to hear his mentor. I'll be good. Please don't leave. That was Present Mike who left. Not your father, the mysterious man tried to explain, but the boy just kept bawling. He kneeled down carefully and wrapped his arms around him gently. The teen was mumbling incoherent apologies, likely to his father as he had been doing in the seconds before. Gami wasn't too sure what his friend was going through, but he had his assumptions. The series of events right before his breakdown were eerily similar to ones from the boy's early childhood, specifically from right before his father's departure. It was plausible that the hero's leaving triggered a dormant memory of his father, but even then, he didn't really know how to help. Izu, I just need you to breathe, he pleaded. He is not here. The sobs started to quiet down, so the spirit figured he was headed in the right direction. He began running his bony hands through his successor's hair, and instantly heard his breathing slow. That was a trick the specter had learned in his years of companionship with Midoriya. For some reason, the gentle affection helped him calm down, or feel more comfortable. Dad. No, he is not here, Gami repeated. It is just me. Just Gami. That finally cleared the teen's head. Gami. Yes. And with that, he jumped onto the ghost with a large embrace, the sobs returning. The two hugged tightly, almost as if they hadn't seen each other in years. I'm sorry, he wailed. I just thought. I saw. He was. But the spirit merely shushed him and held him closer. It is all right. In all honesty, he really had no idea how to handle a situation like this. Should he give it to the boy blunt and just say that his father was never coming back? Or should he console him and give him false hope, even just to boost his mood for the day? Both options felt dirty, so the ghost just tried to assure him that all was good. But even that didn't feel right. He wished he could do so much more for the broken boy in front of him. Then, Midoriya's stomach growled, ruining the sincerity of the moment. That made the teen burst into giggles and he wiped the tears away. Gami too gave a small chuckle, but it was relatively silent compared to his successor. He lifted his crumpled form off the floor and dragged his feet into the kitchen. The house sported an open concept floor, with the living room flowing into the kitchen quite nicely. The kitchen itself was fairly large and even had an island counter. He reached for the refrigerator handle to open it, but stopped abruptly. What was he doing? This wasn't his house, and he couldn't just take food that wasn't his. At least when he was living with his mother, he could buy his own food. That's what he used to cook his meals and feed himself. He made sure that there were no real grounds for his mother to get upset at him concerning food. But here, he didn't own any of the food. There was no way he could eat anything that wasn't his and get away with it. He recalled the first few times he had taken some of his mother's food without realizing the consequences, and the memories made him shudder. There was absolutely no way he would take something and risk rage like his mother's. But his stomach grumbled again, louder and more violent this time. He had been lucky enough to have eaten a full lunch at school today, considering he wasn't planning to, but it had been hours since that. Not to mention Recovery Girl had sucked his stamina dry. He was practically running on fumes, combined with his overactive imagination on what could be inside the fridge, and he was desperately battling the urge to yank open the handle. What is it, Izu? His mentor asked with concern. Right. He had been staring at the closed fridge for what was probably too long to be considered normal. I can't take anything, he replied almost sadly, but calm enough to signify that this was normal to him. What? What do you mean? Well, it's Aizawa Sensei's food, I think. He still wasn't sure exactly who was living in this house. I can't just take it. I'm sure he will understand, the ghost tried to assure him. But Midoriya just shook his head. I'm not taking anything. Gami didn't really understand why the boy was resistant to taking some food, but he wasn't about to let him starve. Not on his watch at least. Why don't you cook a meal for everyone? He pondered. Isn't that just the same thing? The teen questioned skeptically. The spirit wasn't too proud about tricking his successor, but he really needed the boy to eat something, even if it was under the guise of a selfless act. No, you are cooking for them as well, not only yourself. They will be so pleased by the kind gesture that they may offer you a portion as well. He knew that the heroes wouldn't let the teen starve, even if they didn't like him. But he also knew that in his friend's trauma-ridden mind probably wouldn't see it like that. This was for his sake. Yeah, that makes sense, he answered. That was thankfully enough to convince the teen as he opened up the refrigerator. But upon his flabbergasted expression, the ghost floated over to see what had caught his attention. The fridge was almost as barren as the guest room Midoriya had been given. There was barely any food on the shelves, and any that there was definitely didn't seem fresh. He almost seemed dejected at opening up the fridge. His imagination had hyped him up so much, and the disappointment hit hard. Well, this is a letdown. That couldn't be more true. He shuffled through, pushing past containers of leftover food, searching for something decent enough to cook with. And even if he found something, what would he even make? He didn't really know what Aizawa liked. If he was going to use his food, the dish had to be perfect. He rummaged through some more and pulled out a container of white rice. Upon further examination, he guessed it was about 2 days old, which wasn't too bad. "I think there are some vegetables in the back," Gami commented. Midoriya hummed, but searched where his mentor had told him. Sure enough, there was a small container of steamed vegetables, so he took that out as well. It wasn't much, but it should be enough for 2 portions, maybe even 3. And still, rice and vegetables wasn't really enough to be considered a meal. He needed to find some sort of protein. Laying the rice and vegetables on the counter, he squatted back down to continue raiding the fridge. He scoured container after container, opening up ones he thought had what he was looking for. But either it wasn't exactly what he was looking for, or it smelled too funky for him to feel comfortable using. He could feel himself grow more frustrated by the minute, and his stomach more hungry. "Is that not chicken back there?" The teen's head swiveled towards the spirit's outstretched finger. Scrambling through the fridge, he pulled out a container and lifted open the lift. When the smell of chicken met his nose, he smiled in relief. This was definitely fresh enough to use, and he had a pretty good idea of what he was going to make. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Midoriya smirked. "Most definitely." The kitchen was full of delicious aromas as the sizzle from the open skillet invaded the air. Midoriya flipped the vegetables sautéing in the pan before pulling them back on the stove top. He moved over to the counters, where he laid out 2 large plates and then a smaller one for himself. He didn't want to set out a plate for himself at first, thinking the heroes might get angry at him for serving himself with their food, but Gami managed to convince him to at least take out the plate. He didn't have to serve himself after all. The smell of scrambled eggs hit his nose hard, so he rushed over to the stove to check on them. He figured they were done since their edges were a crisp golden brown, so he slid them off the pan and onto a small plate. The ghost watched in amazement as his successor sliced up the eggs into microscopic pieces with a large chef knife. He loved watching the boy cook, and times like made him wish he could eat. He couldn't smell the countless scents that were currently whirling around the kitchen either, but he was certain they were mouth-watering. The teen then pushed the small pieces of scrambled eggs into the pan, sautéing the vegetables. Lowering the temperature so the bok choy and the broccoli florets wouldn't wilt, he set the pan down to check on the rice. He'd left that in a small pot with some water to boil, and the moisture rejuvenated the rice back to its sticky, fresher self. He opened the drawer where he discovered the utensils were and reached for a spoon, pushing past his nervous hesitation. He took one tiny taste of the rice, and his stomach's subsequent growl confirmed it was ready. He snagged the 2 oven mitts from their resting spot on top of a hanging cabinet and slipped them over his own gloves. Carefully, he gripped the pot's handles and carried it over to the dining room table, which he set before he started cooking. Still with the mitts on, he scurried back and took the vegetables off the stove top as well, placing them next to the rice. Having just a bit of time left, he quickly placed each plate down in front of a chair, leaving his own on the counter. "That looks amazing, Izu. But aren't you missing the—" Midoriya held up one oven mitt, silencing his companion, and just as he did, the oven beeped. He turned off the oven completely, before opening it up and sticking both hands inside. He slowly pulled out beautifully breaded strips of chicken and brought that to the table as well. Once that was done, he took off the mitts and stepped back to admire his work. "You really outdid yourself this time, especially considering the ingredients you had to work with," the spirit praised. "I just hope they like katsudon," he murmured back, ignoring the praise entirely. "I mean, I don't even know who's coming back. Is it going to be Aizawa-sensei, or Mick-sensei, or both of them? I am sure that whoever comes back will enjoy this," the transparent man reassured. "I know I sure would." "Well, I'm not sure when anyone will be back," he sighed. "Let me at least put the covers back on so the food doesn't get cold." And with that, the boy leaned over the table and placed glass lids on all the pots and pans, sealing the warmth with the food. His stomach churned at the sight and he clutched it tightly, hoping to quiet himself down. Gami looked over with concern. "Why not serve yourself now? I am sure they will not mind." But Midoriya was unfazed. "No, I'll wait." The ghost tried to press more, but his successor walked away to put cups on the table. He sighed and stared at the food the boy had made. The man waved a hand towards one of the serving utensils, but it only went through. His shoulders slumped dejectedly. He could only hope those heroes got back soon so his friend could eat. The teen wished he had his kettle so he could make tea, but alas, he did not. So instead, he settled for water. Reaching for the pitcher, he set that down on the table as well. With that, he figured the table was complete. Now, it was best for him to retreat back into the guest room until whoever arrived. He was afraid that if the heroes saw him and realized he had used their food to cook, they would be too angry to care that the meal was for them. But if he was out of sight by the time they came back, then the heroes would have no choice but to check out what he made. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but it was his best shot at maintaining peace as well as maybe getting some dinner. He figured that he had a few moments to spare, so he stood by the table and just took in the savory aromas and the serene calmness. He felt his heartstrings sigh. What he wouldn't give for a warm meal right now and a family to share it with. Only around half a minute had passed. And while he knew he should get going, the longing in his heart figured 30 seconds more wouldn't hurt. The front door opened abruptly. Well, thanks to the stupid longing in his heart, he was now royally screwed. "Sho, I just don't understand why you're so against this." Yamada was looking behind him as he unlocked the door and didn't see Midoriya or the cooked meal right away. "I think you may be overreacting a bit." "Look, Sashi, I already explained this to you on the way here," Aizawa remarked and walked inside. That's when the teacher's eyes met Midoriya's petrified ones. He stopped talking immediately and just stared at the boy in front of him. Yamada noticed the silence and looked into the house as well, looking for what exactly shut the man up. His eyes landed on the student too, and then moved over to the fully set table. The timid boy felt all the color drain from his face when that front door swung open. What should he do? Should he just make a run for the room? Should he just try and wait it out? Should he say something? Or wait for one of his teachers to say something first? He was stuck in his own head again, slowly drowning himself in his panic. And yet, even through all of that, his brain just narrowed in on the fact that this all felt so familiar. He was being hit by some major deja vu again. "Midoriya," Present Mike started softly. "What did you do?" But the teen completely took that the wrong way. He had messed up. This was exactly why he needed to be tucked away in the room before anyone came home. Aizawa took one big sniff of the air. "You cooked? What food did you even use?" That made the boy's blood pressure spike even higher than what it was before. This was a terrible idea. He shouldn't have dared to touch food that wasn't his. Hadn't he learned his lesson with his mother? He stuttered, fear prickling at his fingertips. But the rational man took an intimidating step forward, tossing what looked to be a folder onto the couch. Midoriya took a small step backwards in fear, afraid of the closing gap between the two of them. Aizawa eyed the food on the table in confusion, speaking his thoughts aloud. "All I had in that fridge was leftovers. How did you even make that?" The teacher moved another step closer, so the teen took two back. His sock caught a nail sticking up slightly from the hardwood and sent him tumbling down. He landed roughly on his rear, but that did nothing to shake him out of the paralyzing fear that racked his whole body. "Twam sorry." His voice wavered wetly, the tears to his eyes stopping by his throat first. Aizawa softened a little, but the boy was too terrified to notice. "Problem child, just get off the floor." "What are you doing on the floor there, Izuku dear?" No, he stammered. "Please, have I ever told you how much you look like your father?" He raised his hands to his ears, hoping to block the harrowing cries out. "I'm as sorry." The normally tired man looked back to Yamada in distress, unsure of how to handle the situation in front of him. Even the blonde, with the vast amount of experience dealing with children in his career of being a UA teacher, never dealt with one as emotionally distressed as the one in front of him. "It made me so sad when he left." "How could you make your own mother so sad?" "Please, I won't." Midoriya was sorry. How much more could he stress that? "I won't do it again." Aizawa wasn't sure what the boy was apologizing for, but whatever it was, it seemed to be causing him a lot of stress. He was still on the floor, covering his ears closely and trembling violently. And while he had dealt with his fair share of children, he never really got involved with the ones that UA pulled from their homes. He couldn't understand why Nezu had chosen him to foster this kid, other than the fact that he was a student in his class. He wasn't good with kids. He couldn't handle a situation like this. But despite his inexperience, he couldn't just leave him on the floor. So he removed one hand from his pocket and outstretched it towards the prone teen, offering it to hoist him up. When the boy didn't take it, or even react to it, he took a few more steps forward, now slightly looming over him. "Why oh why? Why have you done this to me, Izuku?" Midoriya scrambled to his feet and turned tail, his breathing becoming erratic. His sudden movement surprised both teachers, but Aizawa snapped out of it quickly. His hero instincts kicked in and he chased after the frightened student. The pro called out for him, but wasn't answered. The teen couldn't hear anything but the overwhelming sound of his heartbeat in his ears as he scampered down the hallway. He didn't have to hear the footsteps behind him to know he was being chased down. He turned the corner and dashed towards the guest room. The door was so close, he could almost reach it. His whole body was shivering in utter panic. But he pushed himself to keep running. He couldn't get caught. He couldn't let himself get caught. Every time he did, it hurt. Every time he did, she hurt him. He bursted into the room, using his shoulder as a battering ram. His lungs ached from the invasive sobs as well as his dash to safety. But he couldn't rest yet. He had skidded to a stop a few feet away from the door, and he needed to lock it. Turning around, he almost broke down in terror at seeing someone running right towards the room. He lunged for the door. She had never been this fast before. Why was she so fast? She was going to reach the room before he could make it to the door. He wasn't going to get to the door in time. She was going to catch him. No. Kami flung into the door from inside the room, and his shoulder slammed it shut. His fingers flew to the lock and he clicked that closed too. He had no time to ponder his solidity as his successor was still mid-dive. The ghost zoomed over and caught the boy before he could face plant onto the hardwood. He cradled him closely with his oversized sleeves as the boy blubbered out inaudibles and incoherence. Then, Aizawa slammed into the door. The bang scared more sobs out of the crumpled teen, but his mentor held him close. Running soft strokes through his unruly hair, the spirit just tried to comfort him. But what he didn't realize was that the bang was echoing through Midoriya's head, and it sounded an awful lot like fists bashing on a door. "Why did you drive Hisashi away from me? Why did you have to be quirkless? Don't you realize what you have done to me? I'm sorry," he wailed into his mentor's arms. "Please, I'm sorry. Izu, I do not understand." The boy gripped the ghost's robe tightly. "Please don't let her in." "Her," the specter repeated. "I do not know." Then it hit him. His mother. Midoriya was talking about his mother. But she wasn't here right now, so what was he talking about? Was this related to the episode he had earlier, where he had mistaken present Mike for his father? "Izu, that is not your mother. She is not here," he tried to explain. He looked up at the ghost, fat tears still streaming down his face. But Kami couldn't let this go on any longer. That was Eraserhead, not her. After that statement, the wails quieted down into sniffles, the teen's panic changing into realization. But unlike the first time, he stuttered out no words. Together, they sat there on the floor, not caring how many minutes went by. No noise came from beyond the door either, just empty silence. Empty, beautiful silence. The minutes turned to hours, and Midoriya hadn't dared to leave the room. He could hear hushed whispers coming from just beyond the hallway, but no matter how close he pressed his ear to the wall, they were too muffled to understand. He had passed the time by messing around with some souls. Originally, he was trying to get some sorting done, but his mind was the further place from responsibility right now. So he switched to instead tossing them from hand to hand, wishing he could feel more of the bright warmth that radiated from some. After some moments of recollection, the boy had realized how much he had fucked up. It hadn't even been a full day yet, and he was sure Aizawa would want him gone. He wasn't worth all the trouble he was. Times like now he wished the universe would have pity on him and just erase him from existence. Tommy had enough of watching his successor just mope around and sulk. His friend did that practically every day, and he wanted to see it changed. "Why don't you do something different?" he suggested, nudging the soul out of the teen's hand. "Like what?" he moaned drearily. The ghost motioned to something that lay on the desk. But from the floor, Midoriya couldn't see what it was. So he shakily rose to his feet and shuffled over to the desk. The only thing on it was his phone, his notebook somewhere else in his backpack. He wasn't sure what his mentor had in mind, but he grabbed it anyway and moved back to his spot on the floor. He tossed his phone from hand to hand, but Gami quickly put an end to that. "That is not what I meant." The teen rolled his eyes sarcastically, but stopped throwing the device around. He unlocked it and clicked through some of the applications, opening up his news feed to check if there was anything interesting on there. Sadly, there wasn't, so he exited out of that. He raised his finger to press something else, his gloves working on the touchscreen surprisingly, when the spirit gave him a hard nudge, changing his hand's trajectory. "Hey," he whined, "what was that for?" "Sorry," the man huffed, "my bad." Midoriya was not convinced. "Are you being sarcastic with me right now?" "Me, never." Gami faked some shocked body language, since his face couldn't be seen. The boy just shook his head and looked back down at his phone. Because of the push, his finger ended up clicking his contacts instead. The list was pretty barren, probably even more so than the room he was currently staying in. There were only 3 numbers in his phone. The first was Ishihara's old number. He couldn't bring himself to delete the number, even though he couldn't call the man anymore. The family must have still kept the phone number in circulation because anytime he clicked on it and let it dial, he was met with the voicemail, not a machine telling him the number was out of circulation. Sometimes, on days that were particularly rough, he let it ring just to hear the man's voice again. But he didn't really think today was a day he needed it, especially since it usually made him cry afterwards. He had done enough of that already. The second was some old food delivery service. He used it on nights he wasn't able to cook, or didn't feel like it, which wasn't often. It was fairly expensive, enough for him to deem the service only for special occasions or dire emergencies. But the katsudon they made was delicious. It rejuvenated the fading memories of when his mother used to cook dinner for him, and brought him warmth on days that were especially cold, both physically and emotionally. The third and final number was Todoroki's, from earlier today. It was appropriately named Sho, at least, in the ghost's opinion. His eyes hovered over the name. "Here, we'll figure this out together." Sure, the boy had offered his assistance concerning his situation, but could Midoriya truly burden him with his complaints? His morals told him that wasn't right, but he still eyed the name like it was an option. His finger hung over the contact. All it would take would be one push, but he'd then be roping the student into his own problems. This was probably another formality thing. Todoroki was only offering his help to be polite. He didn't really mean for the offer to be taken up. The specter sensed his successor's hesitation, and moved in for the assist. There was no way he was going to let the boy self-doubt himself out of this one. This was all part of his master plan after all. He knew his friend needed a trustworthy, reliable person to confide in, and he figured Todoroki was just the friend Midoriya needed. "Why don't you just send him a text?" he proposed sneakily, just wanting to slip the idea into the boy's mind. "It does not even need to be about this," he hummed in contemplation, weighing the ghost's words. He was right. The text didn't even need to be about the turmoil he was currently going through, just something short and pleasant. So he clicked on the contact and started typing. "Hey, this is Izuku from class. How are you?" He hit the send button nervously. Was that too informal? Maybe he should have been more specific about what class. Should he have said class 1A? His doubts were whirling through his head. This was a mistake. He never should have done this in the first place. But his phone dinged back and cut through his suffocating thoughts like a knife. He picked it up for a read. "Hey Izuku, I am doing all right, though that may be because I have not run into my father yet. What about you?" He wasn't sure if Todoroki was trying to make a joke or was genuinely serious, though, based on the boy's personality, he figured it was more likely the latter. Though, how should he respond back? He thought about it for a moment. There was no real need to involve Todoroki in his issues. Besides, this was just how the formality went. "I'm doing good. Just chilling, I guess." God, now that he was reading that text back, he felt himself cringe into yesterday. He had never texted another classmate before, much less a friend. How was he supposed to know what to say or how to talk? "Did you figure out your living situation?" Todoroki always went straight to the point. He didn't want to lie to the boy, but at the same time, he didn't need to spill all the details. "Yeah," he facepalmed. That was too obnoxious of an answer. Why did he even text Todoroki in the first place? He was too stupid for this. So, what happened then? Well, he certainly didn't know when to quit. A lot of people he once admired were like that. Bakugo, All Might. Did this mean his friendship with Todoroki was destined to fail? You do not have to tell him, but I do not think he means any harm. Maybe Gami was right. Midoriya certainly couldn't remember a time when the ghost wasn't. He could give this friendship with Todoroki a shot. Principal Nezu sent me off with Aizawa-sensei. But from what I've seen, Mick-sensei lives here too. That was all the truth. Though, he still wasn't sure what relationship his English teacher had with his homeroom teacher. Oh, is that all working out well? This was it. He either told Todoroki the entire story, or kept him in the dark. He let himself have a few moments to think it over, but he was surprisingly torn. So he looked over to his mentor for guidance. The spirit knew he would have to be the tiebreaker here. This was really important to the boy, but he didn't have to give it any more thought. He knew his answer. This was all for his sake. He confided in you that first day. Give him a chance. That was all the convincing he needed. Well, not really. I don't think Aizawa-sensei likes me here very much. It didn't take long for his phone to ping again. Oh, why is that? Right, Todoroki didn't know anything that happened in the nurse's office. He'd forgotten about that. Well, Nezu-san must have made the decision by himself, because even Aizawa-sensei was surprised. Plus I had a really bad panic attack in front of him. I've been hiding out in the guest room since. I think I annoy him. Shoot, was that too much information? He purposely left out the panic attack he had after President Mike left, deeming that unimportant to the conversation since no one was around to witness it. But even still, he might have overshared. A panic attack. What did he do? He could feel the murderous intent coming off that single message. Was Todoroki really that concerned over him? Maybe it wasn't just a formality thing. It wasn't really his fault. There was a situation. It just reminded me too much of something from my childhood. I kind of freaked out and ran. There were a few moments of silence, then another ding. Are you all right now? Midoriya didn't hesitate with his response. Yeah, I'm good. Just needed a breather, I guess. He had needed much more than a breather, but Todoroki didn't need to know that. A soft knock came from upon the door, startling the phone right out of his hands. It landed with a soft thud against the hardwood, but other than that it was fine. Yamada's voice rang out. Hey Midoriya, it's been almost an hour. Do you want to join us for dinner? Wait, really? Even after all that had happened, they were still offering him food. His stomach was surely empty. He couldn't pass up an offer like this. Yeah, if that's okay. He added another comment quickly. I'll be out in a minute. He listened as the loud man's footsteps moved away from the door until they disappeared into the distance. He then picked his phone off the floor and sent one last cluster of messages to Todoroki. I have to go. Dinner and all that. Talk to you later. He set the phone down on the desk and wearily walked out of the room, shutting the door behind him. Gami followed him out, phasing right through the wall instead. Midoriya had left so quickly though, he failed to hear one last ping. All right, stay safe. By the time Midoriya arrived at the table, Yamada was already seated. It was a small rectangular table, and Aizawa sat at one side along with the English teacher. The two adults had already served themselves each a plate of rice, topped with evenly sauteed vegetables and chicken. Even an hour later, the smell was still delightfully potent in the air, and it made his stomach growl. Like an injured animal, he wandered over to the table wearily, waiting for instructions. He didn't make eye contact with either man, instead opting to look at his feet. He couldn't see either of them analyzing him with terrifying intent. Present Mike was the first to speak up, but he usually was. The man's announcer tendencies carried with him throughout his daily life, and it naturally shined through even when he didn't mean it to. Midoriya, he started, you can sit down wherever you'd like. The boy nodded quietly, but made no comment. He sat down in a chair of his own, on a side completely to himself. There really wasn't any room for him to sit on the same side as the teachers anyway, even if he wanted to. Yamada passed him a plate. It wasn't one of the small ones that he had set out for himself earlier. It was the same size as the other two that were out. That surprised him, but he dared not to say a word about it, risk it getting switched out. He took the plate from the pro's outstretched hand and set it down in front of him. But even then, he didn't serve himself right away. He had never really eaten with anyone in a long time. Sure, these past 2 days, he had lunch with Uraraka and Ada, but 2 isolated incidents didn't really change years of past experiences. Both teachers watched as the teen simply stared at his empty plate. It was almost like he had never eaten with others before. You can serve yourself whatever you want. The blonde piped up for both of them. You don't have to wait for instructions or anything. Gami added his 2 cents. Just take advantage of the situation. This is a tasteful meal you cooked. Now you get to have a portion of it. That gave Midoriya the confidence he needed to grip the serving spoon for the rice. He plowed it into the mound of rice in the pot and scooped up a small portion from himself. The entire time he moved it onto his plate, he watched the heroes carefully. He eyed them suspiciously, as if they'd take back their generosity any second. Then he moved to the vegetables, and then the chicken, but not without losing his apprehensiveness. But the pros never changed their mind about the food, and while that would normally be a calming thing, it only made him more paranoid. He poked at his food nervously, not really sure if he should start. But the smell eventually got to his raging stomach and he took a bite. The mess of flavors exploded in his mouth, only amplified by his hunger. It was delicious, more delicious than he could have ever imagined. Part of his overly anxious mind was expecting one of the adults to take the food away from him, so he began shoveling mouthful after mouthful, not wanting to waste a single second. Yamada had already started his food before Midoriya had, but he was flabbergasted at the boy's eating speed. He was already almost finished with his plate, and the teacher was barely halfway done. He was worried the student might choke, so he attempted to make some light-hearted conversation like he had done on the way to the house. So Midoriya, he began, I didn't know you could cook. This katsudon is really good. The teen swallowed the mound of rice in his mouth thickly. Yeah, I'm just glad you think it's okay. Sorry about using your food without asking. The 2 teachers shared a puzzled glance. Was that the reason for the mess that happened earlier? If it was, what did that reveal about this kid's home life? Was he not allowed to touch the food at home? The blonde tried to make some progress amending the situation. Oh, it's really no problem. Those leftovers would have probably gone to waste anyway. Still, that didn't ease the boy's worries. He didn't respond to the comments, and dinner fell into uncomfortable silence. Aizawa still didn't make any efforts to join into the conversation, and Yamada was becoming frustrated. He racked his brain for a good way to get the man into the discussion. Hey Sho, he started, surprising both the teacher and the student. Did you know that Midoriya here likes to analyze quirks? Aizawa shot a glare at the loud man. No, I didn't. Well, he does, and he's super good at it. He practically yelled. The little listener's even done some notes on you. That caught the pro's attention. Oh, both adults looked over to Midoriya, one in excitement and one in dulled interest. The teen felt his face go pale and his throat ran dry. This was such a 180 from before, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. Gami placed a bony hand on his successor's left shoulder. Just take your time, the ghost advised. You do not have to share more than you are comfortable with. He gave the spirit a slight nod and turned back to face his homeroom teacher. Well, your quirk is erasure. It lets you erase non-mutant type quirks when you look at someone. Aizawa jumped in, seemingly annoyed. Well, that's obvious. Yamada elbowed him hard under the table, and the ragged man cursed under his breath. Don't mind him, please continue. The boy's confidence caved in hard. He felt his passion for the conversation die off. He really didn't want to keep talking, but it would be rude to just leave now. He shoveled in the last few bites left on his plate and pushed his utensils to the side. It's fine, he stuttered. I'll just get you my notebook. It's got some of my notes on Aizawa-sensei. He stood up from his chair and scurried off back to the guest room. Once the boy was mostly out of earshot, the blonde turned to face his fellow teacher. Sho, what are you doing? He hissed. I get that you don't think you're qualified for this, but that doesn't give you a reason to be a jackass to the kid. Aizawa was taken aback by the use of foul language. Fuck, I'm sorry, Zashi. He held a hand up to his forehead and ran the other through his messy hair. I'm not asking you to apologize, the pro continued. I'm asking for you to give this your full effort. The tired man tried to backtrack. I already told you I. Well, you're not, he almost yelled, but kept his voice under control. The sudden interruption caught Aizawa off guard and he promptly shut up. Yamada scooted his chair closer and brought his voice down to a whisper. Look, we still don't know the full extent of what this kid went through. We have to treat this with care and sensitivity, especially after whatever happened earlier. And you purposely being a jerk isn't helping. Eraserhead sighed, knowing he was completely in the wrong. You're right. But that wasn't enough for present Mike, and I'll try and do better. That's what I like to hear. The loud blonde smiled. The two quickly shut their mouths as a set of footsteps from the hallway grew louder. Their hero instincts kicked in and they slowed their breathing to make less noise. Both could make out slight whispers and strained to hear more. Don't get me wrong, I am curious. The next set of words were muffled by footsteps. But the footsteps eventually quieted down. I can't just ask them that. That'll just give them more reasons to not want me around. The teachers didn't bother to pretend they weren't eavesdropping when Midoriya turned the corner and reappeared into the dining room. He was holding a thin notebook in one hand, a little battered but in good condition overall. He looked startled to see them there, and jumped slightly when making eye contact. Aizawa cut straight to the point. Ask us what? Yamada noticed the boy squirm under the piercing gaze and gave a look to the man next to him. Eraserhead immediately softened, but kept up his neutral facade. Gami's a bit confused on what exactly your relationship is. Between you and Mix-sensei, I mean, he added another comment under his breath. I'm a little curious too. Present Mike watched the other hero carefully. He wasn't going to say anything. This was the perfect opportunity for him to see how Aizawa would handle this situation. He hoped the hero took their little heart-to-heart seriously. This was his chance. The ragged pro just sighed. Yamada and I are married. Have been for a good 5 years now. Midoriya was surprised at the blunt answer. I'm going to ask you to keep this under wraps for obvious reasons, he continued, but the smugness in his voice was gone. The amount of media attention around relationships between pro heroes is fatal to anyone underground. Yeah, he replied, will do. The boy stood there awkwardly for a few moments, no one in the room saying a word. Then he slid the notebook onto the table, away from the food. Here's the book, he clarified. Aizawa-sensei is on pages 48 to 52. And there's a little more on page 117. What about me? Present Mike joked. The teen seemed to understand it was a joke and smothered a laugh. You're in a different book? Sorry. The two shared a smile and the student instantly felt more at ease. He reached for one of the pots in the middle of the table and wrapped his hand around the handle. The blonde teacher looked confused. What are you doing? He asked a little too quickly. Midoriya immediately flinched back and let go of the handle. I was just going to put the food away. Aizawa felt like it was a good time to jump in. Don't worry about it, problem child. We'll pick it all up later. He clearly wasn't expecting the nice gesture from the intimidating pro, but he didn't shy away as much. Okay. He didn't feel the need to stick around in the dining room anymore, so he quietly started moving towards the hallway entrance. The boy still had a lot of souls to send away before he went to bed. And the earlier he started, the better. Yamada noticed the student trying to retreat and stood up slowly from his chair, understanding from his quick question that suddenness made the teen uncomfortable. Midoriya, he called out, but kept his volume steady. Said boy stopped in his tracks and looked back behind him. Yes, the answer was so small, so scared that it almost made the hero forget about his thought in the first place. If you need anything, or if there's anything we can do for you, just let us know. He nodded and turned to leave, but only a few steps later, he flipped back around and called out shakily, Can you not call me Midoriya? Anything else is fine. Present Mike flashed a friendly thumbs up. No problem, little listener. Aizawa chuckled from the table. Pretty sure I've already got that under control. Both conformations were enough for the teen to feel comfortable leaving. And so that's exactly what he did. The two heroes listened as his footsteps grew fainter and fainter, until they couldn't hear them at all. A subsequent groan of a door on its hinges was all they needed to hear to confirm he had made it to his room. Present Mike turned to his husband, knowing the boy was out of earshot. Who exactly is Gami? Aizawa just let out an exasperated sigh. I'm not explaining that right now. Over the next few days, the boy barely left his room. The spirit tried to coax him out for more than just food and school, but he was practically unsuccessful, despite any kinds of motivation from Gami. He still felt mostly uncomfortable in the new environment. Yamada did his best to interact with his student as much as possible. Whether it was sparking a conversation at dinner or just calling jokes through the closed door, he made it happen. But even his natural cheeriness just wasn't enough to make Midoriya feel comfortable in the home, and Yamada knew that. The teacher wasn't ready to give up, but could feel himself grow more and more unmotivated after each attempt. Aizawa felt largely indifferent despite also noticing the tension in the house. He just wasn't used to being overly emotional or caring. And when he was, it was only towards his husband. He did promise the blonde that he would try harder when it came to making the teen feel at home, but promising and actually doing are two different things. Said hero was currently sitting on the couch, flipping through Midoriya's notebook. He had gotten home earlier than Yamada and the boy was hiding away in the guest room. He had been looking through the book throughout the days after he had received it, and couldn't deny he was impressed. The notes inside were very thorough, and the actual analysis was astonishingly advanced. He found the pages dedicated to himself and wished he hadn't shut the teen down at dinner all those days ago. The front door swung open suddenly, a long creak resonating in the air. Eraserhead turned sharply, but his eyes only met his partner's. He loosened and let his shoulders relax, going back to flipping through the notebook. "Hey Zashi," he greeted. "Hopefully whatever made you stay late wasn't too bad." "No, it was just some paperwork I needed to catch up on," the blonde replied. "You know, with the whole new school year and everything." The hero then noticed his tired husband wasn't paying much attention to his ramblings, so he took a few steps closer to analyze him. He was almost fully engrossed in a thin notebook in his hand, and he quickly realized it was the one Midoriya had left for him on the table that first night. "Hey, isn't that the little listener's notebook?" he asked rhetorically. "You're finally reading it? Huh, what do you think?" Aizawa turned to face him with a bit of unusual enthusiasm, then flashing the open page he was on. The page had a quickly sketched drawing of Eraserhead, along with some arrows pointing to his hero costume. There were notes all around the drawing as well as on the next page, mostly short scribbles and scrawling. "The notes in this book are on the level of professional quirk analysts," he said with unnatural pride. "Not only are there in-depth explanations of how exactly the quirk functions, but ways to counter it as well. There's ideas for support gear and fighting styles for heroes." Present Mike lit up, almost as if it were his notes Aizawa was gushing over. "I told you it was worth taking a look at. The little listener just makes me want to go, yeah. Here, listen to this." The rugged man pointed a finger to one of the word blobs next to the drawing of him. "Erasure has a blatant weakness to mutant-type quirks, and while Eraserhead's capture weapon and fighting style are effective ways to combat this disadvantage, he still is largely capable of being overpowered." "Geez, the little listener writes like he's in college," Yamada interrupted to joke. The tired teacher shot him an annoyed glance and the blonde chuckled, but subsequently sealed his lips. Aizawa rolled his eyes, but couldn't help but snort at his husband's antics. He checked to make sure he was pointing to the right part and then flipped the book back in the English teacher's direction. The pro decided now was a good time to continue. Erasure naturally evens out the playing field between the user and the opposer, so creating support gear that mimics that against mutant quirk users would be ideal. An additional weapon like a high-voltage taser or a tranquilizer gun might work, and though that would still leave a disadvantage against mutant quirks with tough skin, it would be effective against most other mutant quirks. "You got support advice too," his partner remarked. "The little listener said I should get some sound grenades, and I'm honestly interested in seeing if my support team can whip up something like he was talking about." "Sound grenades? Huh," Aizawa repeated. "An electric weapon actually doesn't sound like a bad idea. I knew you would like it." Eraserhead knew exactly what the announcer was looking for, and as much as his pride didn't want to admit it, he knew he wasn't going to be able to skirt around it. "You were right." He watched his rowdy partner pump his fist and cheer, hissing out a short "yeah," before returning to his mostly calm, normal self. Finally taking off his jacket, Yamada moved away from the door and kicked off his shoes. He knocked a hand into Aizawa's hair playfully, and the tired man shifted so he could plop himself down next to him. "Any updates on the little listener?" Present Mike quickly changed the subject. The ragged man sighed. "No, the kid's just been hiding away in his room since we got back." Yamada's shoulders slumped and he sighed heavily. "I just wish there was more we could do. He still seems so uncomfortable here even after all these days." Aizawa just sighed again, his words escaping him. He laid the notebook down on his leg and stared at the hallway. He couldn't really understand what the boy was going through. The teen had been taken away from all he'd ever known. Whether he believed it was a safe place or not, it wasn't something he could just fix in a matter of days. He wasn't sure how long it would take for him to get comfortable staying here, but he was sure his crummy attitude at the start definitely didn't help. A slight buzzing from underneath him startled him out of any more depressing thoughts. Moving his hand down, he pulled his phone out of his back pocket. There was only one notification on the lock screen, and so he opened it up to see the details. The blonde man noticed the lack of attention towards him. "What does it show?" Said man flashed his phone screen at Yamada. "It's the vet." Present Mike turned frantic. "Are the cats okay?" Yeah, the cats are fine," he reassured. "We need to pick them up." A relieved sigh left the English teacher. "You should have worded that better. I assumed the worst. My bad." Aizawa lifted himself off the couch, straightening out his wrinkled pants. He slipped his phone back in his pocket before sliding on a pair of general black shoes. He yawned and stretched out his arms before returning to normal. "Are you going to go pick them up now?" Yamada asked. The tired teacher gestured to his pair of outside shoes sarcastically. "Yeah. Are you coming with me?" "Sure." Sounds like he stopped suddenly, his train of thought hopping onto a different set of tracks. They couldn't just leave Midoriya behind. I mean, they physically could, but it wouldn't be right. Just ignoring the fact he was living among them would only further the uncomfortableness in the home. Besides, taking Midoriya with them would be a great way to bond. not only with them, but with the cats as well. The cats had been at the vet since a few days before Midoriya had come into their household because of a FLUTD situation. Somehow, all of their cats had contracted feline lower urinary tract disease and needed serious medical treatment. The teen hadn't gotten a chance to meet their furry companions, and this would be a perfect opportunity. Wait, Yamada cut himself off. Why don't we bring the little listener with us? He hasn't met the cats yet. This would be perfect. That doesn't sound like a bad idea. He shrugged, but you'll have to convince him. The blonde scoffed. You underestimate me, show. But he didn't have time to hear his partner's huff, because he was already walking towards the guest room door. He didn't have any shoes on, but his footsteps were still loud enough to resonate throughout the hallway. He approached the door and immediately heard shuffling coming from behind it. It was fair to assume he had heard him coming. He rapped his knuckles against the hardwood gently, careful not to be too startling. Hey little listener, how are you doing in there? There was more shuffling, but not for too long. I'm fine. Yamada frowned at the blunt answer, but didn't let it get to his head. Well, Sho and I were going to run some errands and we were wondering if you'd want to come with us. Of course, no answer came right away, and his ears were met with only the sound of more shuffling. There were some slight mumbles, but the blonde just assumed he was talking to Gami. His husband had explained Midoriya's situation late that first night. He was skeptical at first. I mean, who wouldn't be? A kid whose powers didn't come from a quirk, and from a ghost no less. It was a lot to take in, but the more time he spent around the boy, the more he realized how much time he liked to spend alone. And when he heard the slight whispers and conversations that came from behind that door, he started to believe his husband's explanation more and more. He had never gotten personally introduced to the ghost, but he hoped he would soon. A call came from the other side, bringing him out of his thoughts. I'll go. If that's still all right. If he was being honest, Yamada wasn't really expecting the kid to agree, much less agree so quickly, but he wasn't complaining. He smiled to himself, pride bubbling in his chest. Sounds great. We'll be waiting by the front door. He moved away from the door to give the kid some space. He didn't want to scare him by waiting right by his door for him to come out. As Present Mike approached the front door again, he sent a smirk right to Aizawa. He was sure his partner had heard the entire thing. The hero rolled his eyes. Fine, fine. You don't have to rub it in. The blonde laughed. He'll be out in a few minutes. He let his chuckling run its course before quieting down. He turned to stare longingly at his husband, growing into a wide smile. This was perfect, just the two of them. It was how it always was, and how the two of them had grown to love. Yamada had always wanted to adopt a kid, but he knew that didn't really fit into his partner's idea of a relationship. So he was content with just living like they always had. Just the two of them, now and forever. Then, the guest room door creaked open, and the two remained two for no longer. Aizawa drove down a busy street, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. Yamada was sitting next to him in the passenger seat, cracking jokes and quips. The two chatted like they always did, with the blonde doing most of the talking and Eraserhead piping in every here and there. The car atmosphere felt so typical for the two of them, and the muffled sounds from the street eased in like background noise. So it was easy for the two to forget that Midoriya was with them in the back seat. The teen just sat quietly, hoping not to draw the hero's attention back on him. When he had left the guest room, their piercing stares shot right through his soul. He immediately regretted his decision to leave the safety of his solitude, but there was no way he could just change his mind now. So here he was, hiding away in the back of the car. Gami was the one who had convinced him to go in the first place. He really didn't want to, but the ghost was desperate for him to open up. His mentor had done so much for him throughout his life, so he almost felt obligated to make him proud. He just kept telling himself that this was for Gami. Currently, the spirit wasn't even in the car. He had tried to sit down in one of the seats, but his form proved detrimental. The boy wasn't sure what to do when the car started and his companion wasn't in it, but Gami just improvised. He could only imagine what someone would think if they could actually see the ghost chasing after the car beside them. His gaze was solely focused on the window beside him, and he watched Gami push to keep up with the car. The car wasn't traveling that fast, maybe about 20 miles per hour, but that was an obnoxiously fast speed to fly at. Well, it was more floating than flying. The car took a left turn and pulled up next to a decently sized building. Midoriya watched as Gami stopped at the entrance and moved towards his car door. The boy unbuckled himself, but waited for Aizawa and Yamada to open their doors before opening his. He looked up at his ghostly companion, and despite not being able to see his face, he was sure he was panting. He shot a joking stare at him, and the spirit just huffed and turned away. Together, they walked into the building behind the two heroes. Contrary to what you may believe, I am not fatigued. Whatever lets you sleep at night, he quipped back. Considering I do not sleep, your statement is invalid. Midoriya smacked his forehead at his mentor's idea of a joke, but he couldn't help but give a small chuckle under his breath. He loved that Gami always tried to contribute, even if it was towards something he didn't understand completely, like how to properly joke. even if he didn't do it exactly right. The attempts always made him cheer up. Now paying attention to their surroundings, the inside of the building was surprisingly clean. The duo figured they were in some sort of reception area, considering the large front desk and the seating area. No one was in any of the seats though, so he still wasn't sure where exactly he was. Yamada sat himself down in one of the chairs, but Aizawa stood up by the front desk. The teen looked between the two individuals, unsure where to move himself. He could sit by Yamada, but would Aizawa yell at him for sitting and being lazy? He could stand instead, but then Aizawa might get annoyed with him. But he also couldn't just stand in the middle of the floor like he was now, picking at his gloves nervously. He could feel his fingers twitch. "Little listener," a familiar voice called out, "come sit over here." That was a direct command. That was something he knew. He could do that. So he listened, walking over to his English teacher and sitting in the chair next to him. He was unnerved by the close proximity, but this was an order, and he knew how to follow an order. Pulling his hands to his lap, he fiddled with his fingers in an attempt to take his mind off of everything plaguing it. Gami moved over to stand next to him, but didn't even try to sit down. Both of them knew there was really no chance of him being successful. Besides, it was much easier to stand. "I wonder where we are." Midoriya was wondering the same thing, but didn't respond as Yamada was right next to him. He didn't know if the blonde hero was aware of his secret, but he wasn't going to give it away. But the Spectre had a point. Supposedly, the two heroes were going out to run errands, and if the boy were to believe his presence didn't change that, he wondered what kind of business they needed done here. All parties watched as Aizawa talked with the female receptionist. She seemed put off by his ragged appearance, but nonetheless gave him the information he wanted. He assumed the man was done, as he made his way back to where all were sitting. "She said Dr. Chisabe should be out to get us in a bit," he repeated to his husband. "Oh okay," Yamada replied. Midoriya didn't say anything, but that didn't keep his mind from wandering. Who was Dr. Chisabe? He was a doctor, but what kind of medicine did he practice? Aizawa had said us, so that must mean everyone was coming along. But then who needed to see a doctor? Was it him? Was that the reason President Mike wanted him to come along? His hands suddenly grew clammy form under his gloves and his throat dry. Was this all just a ploy to get him in front of a doctor? Gami seemed to notice his successor's panic, even though the other heroes didn't. He floated forward and rested his hands on the boy's head, playing with his hair. "Whatever it is, just take a breath and clear your head," the ghost tried to reassure without outright saying he was overreacting. His successor did this a lot, overanalyzing the situation and hyping it up to more than it probably was. Albeit, there were some times where the boy was right, and it ended up being exactly what he was thinking or at least similar to. But he often stressed himself out, and Gami did his best to try and ease that. Midoriya took his mentor's advice, and also took a deep breath into his lungs. Maybe he was overthinking this. Still, lowering his guard would be a foolish idea. He played around with the fabric of his gloves. Maybe just taking his mind off everything would suffice. That was easier said than done, but he would try. Rhythmically, he matched the picking of his gloves with his heartbeat. The tempo echoed around in his head, effectively separating the paranoia from his head. It was almost soothing in a way, but if he thought about it more than that, he knew his paranoia would find a new way to seep into his mind. Sometimes, the boy wondered what life would feel like without his gloves. How did freedom truly feel? He couldn't really say he'd felt freedom. Not when restrained by his job and all his responsibilities and these damn gloves. These gloves were the bane of his miserable existence, just a reminder of how he could never have the luxuries of a normal kid his age. Nurturing parents, childhood friends, a loving household, he could have none of that. Sometimes, he thought his role as death was purposely trying to make him suffer so it could feed off his misery. No, enough of that. He had lost the tempo. It was obnoxiously offbeat from his heart. He just needed to breathe and clear his head. Drain it, even if only for a minute. Match his heartbeat once more. Plucking the fabric again, he got back into the rhythm of things. This time, his head felt empty. It was nice, peaceful. If only every moment was like this. There was a call of his name, then again, and then once more. It snapped him out of his momentary tranquility and his hands ceased movement. He looked up to meet the sound. "Sorry to startle you like that, little listener," Yamada spoke softly, "but Dr. Chisabe is here. We have to go to the back now." Midoriya didn't respond, his mouth oddly dry, but that was a command. So he stood up and followed the blonde hero. He didn't see Aizawa in front of them, so he assumed the underground hero had already left without them. Though, he did wonder why exactly the heroes were at a doctor's office. Together, the two, plus a ghost, arrived at a private back office. Well, it wasn't really an office, more like a checkup room like the ones for pediatrics. Aizawa was already seated in one of the seats, but there was no sign of the so-called Dr. Chisabe. Yamada paused upon entering the room, so the teen cautiously peeked out from behind him to figure out why. At first, he could see no reason for the teacher's stop, but when his eyes focused on Aizawa, his brain kicked into high gear. There was only one open seat left. He wasn't sure why the hero would contemplate giving it to him, but he would straighten things out. "You can have the chair, Mix-sensei," he confirmed. "I can stand." He didn't wait for a response, moving towards the bright window to stand there instead. Yamada seemed to want to stutter, but sighed instead and moved to sit in the empty chair. Aizawa flashed him a slight look, but nothing more. Midoriya watched as Gami followed them inside the room and stood next to him by the window. The blinds were open, letting light flood the room. He could feel the warm sunshine touch his back. The door then swung open and in walked a tall man with decently long brown hair. He wore a set of blue clothing. He looked more like a registered nurse than a doctor, but he of all people knew not to judge a book by its cover. "Ah, Aizawa-san, Yamada-san," he greeted, "and a new face. I certainly haven't seen you before." Present Mike smiled. "This is Midoriya." The doctor continued. "Nice to meet you, Midoriya-kun." The boy shuffled nervously. "You as well, Chisabe-san." He did his best to be respectful. That was the best way to avoid conflict with adults. The doctor just laughed heartily. "Anyways, I'm sure you know from my email, but your cats have all recovered from FLUTD. I was most concerned about your youngest one, but even he has made a full recovery." "What a relief," Yamada sighed. "Indeed, let me go get them now." The doctor left as quickly as he came, leaving the door open this time. Midoriya shifted back towards the window. "Cats." Dr. Chisabe was a veterinarian. There was a feeling of relief at realizing he was only overreacting moments ago, but a new taste of fear replaced that quickly. He couldn't be around animals, he was just too dangerous. His gloves felt slick against his skin, sticky with sweat, but he didn't even notice, too focused on the deadly power tingling at his fingertips. The Brunette returned, this time holding 2 cat carriers in his hands. He placed them on the examination table in the corner of the room. Both Aizawa and Yamada jumped up as Chisabe opened up their doors, while the reserved teen took a fearful step back. The doctor reached inside and pulled out a calm, orange tabby with slight white accents. The cat barely squirmed in his hands, but relaxed even more upon being placed into Aizawa's arms. Chisabe took a glance at the lab on the carrier. Juice recovered the fastest, and though he's a bit chubby, he's nowhere near being overweight. He paused. "They eat dry food just fine, right?" Eraserhead just nodded, stroking the cat in his arms. "That's what I thought." He sighed, pulling out the other cat in that one carrier. It was a beautiful mix of black and white, with defining markings almost like a tuxedo. The cat seemed to sway away the doctor's hand and strutted out himself. He stopped near the center of the table, but continued to stand proudly. Then, Chisabe moved over to the second carrier, and though the door was open, he nudged it further. A little wearily, a pure white cat poked his head around the corner, scoping out his surroundings. Once it made eye contact with Aizawa and Yamada, he instantly calmed and walked out of the carrier himself. Not bothering to go much further, he plopped himself down on the table and curled up lazily. The doctor didn't move though, and seemed to be waiting on something. He sighed and reached into the carrier. Midoriya listened unwillingly as a small cry came from inside and watched the Brunette pull out one terrified tiny kitten. Chisabe looked sadly down at the ball of fur in his hands. "Has he been like this for a while?" he inquired. The blonde nodded drearily. "Lynx is paranoid of almost everything." Chisabe hummed. "And how long have you two had him?" "Well, we adopted him at about 3 weeks old, and he's about 6 weeks now." The doctor put the kitten down and immediately he scurried back into the carrier. "I think that's how this FLUTD outbreak started," he concluded. "Lynx's paranoid behavior is stressing the other cats out." Aizawa sighed, still holding on to Juice. "So what do we do?" "Just keep Lynx separated from the others. That's the best course of action right now," Chisabe explained, "but only until his behavior calms." It was just then that Yamada remembered there was someone else in the room, and he turned over to Midoriya. "I totally forgot to tell you, little listener. We have cats." The boy nodded dumbly. He didn't expect Aizawa to own cats, but even so, he did not want to be around them. Gami was no longer at his side. He had moved away towards the table to look at the 4 fur balls. The blonde gestured towards the cat in Aizawa's arms. "This is Juice." Then he moved over to the table and scratched the head of the tuxedo cat. "This is WhatIf." Continuing with his introductions, he stroked the back of the white cat laying down. "This is Cumulus." Finally, he pointed a finger at the second carrier. "And the little kitten is Lynx." Remembering his manners, Midoriya nodded shakily again, but made no move to come closer. "Would you like to hold one?" "No." The teen cut him off, backing further into the corner he was in and away from the table. Then suddenly he started up again. "To me, no thank you." All 3 adults looked over at the boy weirdly. Gami rushed back over to his successor, standing next to him reassuringly. Chisabe coughed to clear his throat, hoping to ease the tension in the room. "Well, other than that, you're all good to go," he started. "Let me just load these guys back inside." Midoriya suddenly felt the uncomfortableness creep up his spine. He should have phrased that better, or at least been more respectful from the start. He watched the heroes help place their cats back in their 2 shared carriers and wished he had the means to help. He inwardly cursed out his gloves, wondering what fur felt like. Was it as soft as it was claimed? He wished he knew. Following the heroes out of the room, he lagged behind nervously. The carriers in their hands were mostly quiet, with the exception of soft cries from one in particular. That was Lynx, right? The poor kitten was so scared of everything, and he wondered why. The cries tore at his heartstrings and made him long for the ability and the confidence to hold and reassure him. Was that what he sounded like? Was that how he appeared to others, like a lost, scared kitten? At least he had Gami with him every day, but Lynx, he had no one. The other cats, though they were older, didn't seem like they knew how to deal with him. The situation rang oddly familiar to his own. And though Midoriya never put the pieces together to see it that way, one particular ghost certainly did. It was like clockwork. The trio exited the building and got back into the car. The teen didn't bother asking if he could help, too lost in thought to care. He squeezed himself right back into his seat as tight as he could towards the window. Yamada didn't go straight for the passenger seat, instead opting to travel around the car to the other side and open the back seat instead. The boy was afraid he was going to sit in the back with him, so when he didn't climb into the car, he was momentarily relieved. When the hero began loading the carriers into the back, though, he wasn't sure what was worse. He turned his head fully towards his window to stare at Gami, keeping his attention off the growing fear at the back of his mind. Picking at his gloves, he listened for his heartbeat, carefully matching his rhythms to it. He could do this. He just had to follow the tempo, one beat at a time. One beat at a time. Midoriya had spent the next few hours in the guest room, alone, like usual. Well, that wasn't entirely true. Yamada had placed the small kitten, Lynx, in the room with him to separate him from the other cats, and he couldn't just tell the hero not to. So he curled himself up in the corner with his notebook and his phone, as far away as he could from the creature. Lynx seemed to only want solitude as well, as the cat had moved to the opposite corner of the room once he was placed on the ground. He hadn't strayed away from that spot either, which was fine for the teen. But that didn't mean he was going to move away from the only area that felt safe. There seemed to be so much on his mind. And yet, he couldn't really tell in the foggy mess of his head. Too much had happened too quickly, and he couldn't even begin to process it all. It was a sickening type of overwhelm, one that left him drained and unable to even muster up the will to stand. He thought that feeling overwhelmed meant he should be bouncing off the walls, desperate to get out of this suffocating room. But he felt no desire to move at all. He just wanted to waste away, and hopefully sift through his muddy thoughts, out of everything. Out of the vulnerability of admitting his past once more, out of the shock of being taken from everything he knew, out of the torment of reliving his lowest moments. None of that seemed to gain footing as the most prominent thought in his head. Out of everything that really mattered, at least, what Gami would agree that mattered, none of it was on his mind. It was there for sure, but that was the thing. It was just there. He wasn't actively thinking about any of it. It was just treading the murky waters of his mind like a capsized sailor. Why, out of everything, could he only think about one specific set of red eyes? Well, to really be specific, he couldn't take his mind away from the battle training exercise. Even more specifically, the incident that had taken place towards the end of it. He dared not speak of it even in his thoughts, afraid that would be more than enough to will it into existence again. But that didn't stop him from replaying the events over and over and over again like a broken record player. Uraraka had secured the weapon. They had won. It was over. It was supposed to be over. Deku, Bakugo stood by the entrance to the room. The only way out. He was practically smoking from his skin, red-hot steam bubbling off his body. His eyes glittered with anger, such livid hatred he'd never seen before. Sure, Midoriya knew his very presence irked the blonde to no end. But never in the countless years he'd known him had he ever seen such an expression. It was so unusual, even for Bakugo. Something about the sheer loathing that radiated from him in that moment was so uncharacteristic, so unnatural. You played me like a damn fool. I bet you think you're so smart, don't you? He remembered the pure fear that stammered through him as Bakugo raised his gauntlet at them. His heart rate was out of control, and he was so sure he was going to have a heart attack then. But he also remembered the countless reassurances that he fed himself in the seconds before all hell broke loose. He remembered telling himself that Bakugo would never, ever do something as stupid as that. There was no way in hell that the fiery teen would risk his placement at UA, all over some petty rivalry, if it could even be called that. Yes, Bakugo was aggressive. Yes, Bakugo hated his guts to the ends of the earth and back. But he was not an idiot. It didn't make any sense. Why would Bakugo shoot at them? I'll tell you what I think, you fucking runt. I think you should learn your place. And then he went over. He pushed his friends out of harm's way. And he went over the edge instead. He fell, landed on his back, and wouldn't even be thinking about all this in hindsight if he wasn't immortal. Well, at least it was him. If it had been anyone else, well, he'd really rather not think about that. But did that erase the severity of the incident? He couldn't die, that was for sure, but did that excuse Bakugo's actions? No, of course it didn't. He still attacked after the training exercise was officially deemed over, and his actions still put all of them in danger, even if he was the only one injured from them. And of course, every hero watching would think the same. Though, by that standard, only All Might could be considered, but this would obviously go up to Principal Nezu. Midoriya was naive, but he wasn't a fool. Bakugo's hero career was more than likely shot. But was it wrong for him to not want that? Something still felt off. God, if Gami could hear his thoughts now, he'd drill into him that the blonde deserved that. That Bakugo deserved to have his hero career ended before it could even begin. That Bakugo was too head-headed and reckless and uncaring to fulfill a role as a hero. But he didn't really believe that. And it wasn't just childhood naivety thinking for him. Every time he replayed the events over in his head, his gut was filled with such a sourness that his own lips nearly puckered. Something was so terribly wrong about it all, and he couldn't make sense of it. All this, his actions, his hatred, his disregard, it just wasn't Bakugo. And he wasn't perfect, certainly not by any means. Far from it. But, despite his numerous flaws, Midoriya just couldn't see a universe where he'd do what he did. And obviously he'd done that in this universe, but it felt so bizarre, so abnormal, like it was forced upon his very nature. And he just couldn't wrap his head around it, which made sitting in silence, drowning in own suffocating thoughts, so much more painful. He shifted his head to a new placement against the wall, half-heartedly listening to the muffled speeches from the living room to try and pry himself away from the swirling mess of his head. He wasn't meaning to eavesdrop, as he had been in that exact spot before the conversation started, but he couldn't really help it. He couldn't make out specific words, but recognized Aizawa and Yamada's voices instantly. There was a third voice he didn't know at first, but figured its nonchalant tone to be the principal's. The fourth voice, though, he had no idea. All he could tell was that it was a young male's, maybe about mid to late 30s. He had been observing the muffled noises for at least an hour now, tuning in and out, and wondered what it was all about. Gami had been phasing in and out of the room to check, but so far, the ghost hadn't spoken a word. And honestly, Midoriya wasn't sure whether he wanted to know the true nature of the conversation. His outlook on today was already down the toilet, so he was afraid whatever they were talking about couldn't be much better. Normally, Gami would stop him before his spiraling went too far, but the spirit's quietness only reassured his growing paranoia. Then, there was sudden shuffling in the opposite corner of his room, and his head lurched in that direction. It was just the little kitten, now up and pacing back and forth, just barely leaving the corner. He expected Lynx to cry out like he had done earlier, but to his surprise, the cat was completely silent save for his footsteps. He wondered what Lynx was thinking about. What was stressing him out so much? There was nothing even in here that would have provoked him. Was it just in his head? Was it like the boy's own pressing thoughts that eventually consumed him? Before he could spend any more time pondering the anxious cat in the corner, a knock came from the guest room door. "Hey little listener," came Yamada's muffled voice. "We need you out here for some stuff." They needed him. Who needed him? Who was we? Why was he needed? Was he going to be taken away and put somewhere else more fitting? Did they finally stop believing his bizarre story? What was going to happen to him? A small meow came from the corner, snapping him out of his spiraling. Midoriya looked up to meet the wide eyes of the kitten staring right at him. He had stopped pacing and was now just merely staring him down, tail swishing back and forth. Lynx meowed again. "Are you all right?" Gami broke the silence while helping his successor up. "I'm fine," the teen replied, though he wasn't sure who exactly he was responding to. Lynx gave out another cry, eyes still not breaking away from his form. "Little listener," came from just beyond the door again. "Twam sorry," he called back hoarsely, almost as if he'd been crying, which he had not. "I'll be right out." He hoped he could make good on that promise as he heard Yamada's tread leave the area. He knew he had to, as it was a command, but he wasn't sure if he could will his legs to move far enough, the fear still plaguing his body. What was he even scared of at this point? Yamada, Aizawa, the new household, being taken away. The kitten, for goodness sake. No. He wasn't going to start again. His hands moved almost instinctively towards each other, his fingers aching as if they were freezing. The boy pulled at the fabric again. The little trick he had discovered earlier really made him feel calm. He matched his heartbeat easily this time, since it was thumping in his ears. He really didn't want to leave the comfort of this room, even if he wasn't truly alone. He could deal with the company of Lynx if it meant he didn't have to face whoever was waiting for him out there. But he had to. He was told, so he had to. He took a first step, the landing matching perfectly with his echoing heart. Step, beat, step, beat, step, beat, step, beat, step, beat. Soon enough, Midoriya found himself at the door. He found himself turning the doorknob ever so slowly. That was fine. He knew as long as he took steps forward, no matter how slow or timid they were, he would make it through that door. He would make it down the hallway. He would face anything anyone out there threw at him. Besides, the boy knew he wasn't alone. With Gami simply walking beside him, the fears eating at his heart quelled. He didn't even realize he was currently walking down the hallway into the living room. He was just walking with his heartbeat. and boy was it beating fast. Fast enough for his saunter to seem normal. He only looked up once he was sure he was in the living room. He knew it was right where his feet switched from hardwood to carpet. Glancing up, he made sure to keep his head low enough so he wouldn't aggravate anyone. Eye contact was important, but so was reassuring the adult that they were in charge. His guesses from earlier were correct as his submissive gaze focused on the two heroes and Nezu. But that fourth voice was someone he still didn't recognize. He was tall, with short black hair and a long overcoat. His similarly black eyes were almost inviting. But Midoriya knew better than to judge a book by its cover. "Ah, Midoriya," the principal cried. "So good to see you again." "True." The boy made a small wave, but kicked himself upon remembering that this was the principal he was speaking to. "Hello, sir." The rodent laughed. "I told you that Nezu worked just fine." "True." This time, however, he did not respond. The boy knew better than to address him by his name so openly. Nezu seemed to be waiting for him to correct himself, but he kept his vow of silence. Once the principal realized he wasn't going to get a reply, he moved on to his next point. "I'm sure you are wondering," he chuckled on, like this was some sort of game. "This here is Detective Tsukachi from the police department." True, he was a detective. Why the hell was there a detective here? The teen started growing more fearful of why they needed him. "My full name is Tsukachi Naomasa," the man introduced himself. "It's a pleasure." This was most certainly not a pleasure. The detective reacted out for a handshake, and Midoriya's haphophobia and behavioral instincts fought each other violently. In the end, his fear won out and he took a small step back, signaling that he wasn't going to shake hands. The newly introduced Tsukachi narrowed his rectangular eyes, but didn't make anything more of it. Nezu stood up from the couch and walked towards the teen. "Now I'm sure you're wondering what's going on," the principal continued. "I've been having Tsukachis here look into your situation at home." True. Oh, so that's what this was about. He brought his arms up to his chest defensively, right where a big portion of the burn scar lay. He could feel his hands start to shake, but managed to keep his urge to just curl up and die inside him. Kami was still a few paces behind him, but made no move to come any closer. The detective jumped in when Nezu paused. "She's in custody, Midoriya. She can't hurt you anymore." What? He was in shock. What was he supposed to do? He hugged himself like he was his own lifeline, dropping to his knees as his legs gave out on him. He could feel the broken sobs claw their way up his throat and out of his mouth, but he really didn't know why he was crying. Was he crying because he didn't have to go back to her, or because he couldn't go back to her anymore? He was just so lost, and so damn confused. There was complete and utter silence in the living room other than the gut-wrenching sobs coming from the prone boy. None of the adults moved a muscle as Midoriya's shoulders heaved up and down violently. Surprisingly, it was Tsukachi who broke it first. "She was good at avoiding us at first, but we managed to catch her drunk at a bar one night and took her into custody." He spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. "Once she sobered up, we took her statement. Now, I just need yours." The teen looked up shakily, his face entirely red and puffy from crying. He hadn't noticed his ghostly companion had moved up right behind him as he was sobbing. Midoriya's lip quivered, his mouth unable to form coherent words. He just focused his vulnerable consciousness on the spirit's rhythmic stroking of his hair. "You don't have to write anything. All you have to do is talk and answer some questions. I'll record it," Tsukachi explained, hoping it would somewhat ease him. "I know this is a lot to take in." Nezu interrupted, "So we don't have to start right now. If you need time to collect yourself, that is all right." True. The boy turned to Gami, who was still behind him. He had undoubtedly known about what the adults wanted even before Yamada had gotten him from the guest room. So why didn't he say anything? "Just do what is most comfortable for you," the ghost advised. "Do not rush into this if you do not want to." This was just like with Todoroki, or when he was hospitalized in Recovery Girl's office. He had to just do it. If he waited or stalled, the fear would never let him muster up enough courage to try again. "No, I can do this now," he replied. "I need to do this now." True. Tsukachi turned to the principal in confusion, and Nezu also frowned at the odd choice of words, but nonetheless clapped his paws together. "Well then, let us clear out of here so you and Tsukachisen can use this room to talk." True. Aizawa and Yamada got up off the couch and moved to stand in the hallway instead. On the way there, the blonde stopped by Midoriya's fallen form. "You need some help up, little listener?" he asked softly. "No, I'm okay, Foes." He felt a pair of cold hands wrap around his underarms and lift him up instead. Stumbling on his feet, he trudged his depressed self towards the now empty couch and threw himself onto it. Gami floated over to stand by the armrest. Yamada turned back. "You know, little listener, you can have someone sit with you during the statement. You don't have to do this alone." True. The teen had no problem answering that. "I'm not doing this alone. I've got Gami with me." True. "Well, I wouldn't advise talking to Gami during this, Midoriya." Nezu jumped in. "The recording will most likely be used in a trial and we're trying to keep that whole secret under wraps." True. He sighed. The principal did have a point. Sure, Gami could still talk to him during all this, since no one would hear him. But did he want someone to sit with him? And who? The boy didn't even register that the rodent had freely talked about his secret in front of Tsukachi. Nezu would definitely not baby him. He would treat him like the strong individual he was. But he didn't know the principal on any sort of personal basis and didn't want to show his vulnerability to someone he wasn't yet comfortable with. Aizawa was someone he admired. He would feel confident in completing the statement if he had his favorite hero by his side. But Aizawa wasn't really known for his emotional sympathy. And besides, asking the hero to stay with him would probably just annoy him. Yamada had been nothing but nice to him since he had first arrived at the household. He was always gentle and thoughtful with his actions, and though he hadn't really gotten close to the blonde hero, he felt some sort of inviting feeling when he was around him. Besides, it would be the most respectful choice since Yamada was the one who had initially brought it up. "See, can you stay with me, Mix-sensei?" He finally asked, if that's okay. The hero seemed surprised he was picked, but agreed and sat himself down on the couch as well, making sure to give the boy enough space. Aizawa and Nezu continued over to the hallway and stood there, out of sight. Both were still close enough to hear any conversation that happened by the couch, and so Tsukachi hit record on his camera, and Midoriya started talking. There were times where the detective stopped to ask questions, but otherwise it was a steady stream of words coming from the teen. There were a few times where he broke down into tears. Whether from stress or trauma was unknown. There were many times where he stuttered, or paused, needing a moment to collect himself before continuing. But he made it to the end, and was able to tell his entire story. Tsukachi had needed to record his injuries and scars after he had finished, and the teen was apprehensive at first, but when Gami talked him through it, he accepted. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing the numerous chunky scars from being impaled by liquor bottles. He made sure to separate the one circular scar on his left arm from the rest, explaining he had gotten that in an unrelated accident. Lifting his shirt to reveal the massive burn scar was the most challenging, but he knew he had to. He ended up having to take his shirt off completely so the detective could see the extent of the injury. Yamada was in pure shock during the recording. He knew things with Midoriya weren't good, but he had no idea it was this bad. Aizawa had told him as much as he knew, albeit it wasn't much. But hearing it straight from the student was a whole other experience, one that ripped his heartstrings into shreds. Tsukachi eventually got all the information he needed for the statement, and turned off the video camera. Midoriya pulled his shirt back on quickly and the other two adults stepped back into the living room. Well, this brings us to my other course of action. Nezu cut right to the chase, which is where Midoriya will be staying. True, the rodent gestured to the detective, motioning for him to speak. I didn't want to say this before I took your statement, just to make sure it didn't interfere with your account. But your mother is in our custody permanently until the trial begins. At the shocked expression now plastered on the teen's face, he clarified, my quirk is called lie detector. It allows me to pick up on whether direct statements are true or false. There were numerous points in Inko Midoriya's statement where my quirk registered her as lie. Enough that it would be safest for us and you that she remained in our custody. His legs would have given out on him again if he were standing, but thankfully he was still sitting on the couch. Gami scooped him into a hug, whispering small reassurances. Everything he knew was suddenly ripped away from him. All his familiarity was now gone. He had lost his parents, his home, what next? And even if his parents weren't necessarily good people, they were all he ever knew. He just wanted to make his mother proud. Was that so much to ask? I think it's best to keep Midoriya here until further notice. Nezu's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. If he were to enter the foster system, it might prove problematic to his studies here at UA. True, the principal didn't mention that he also wanted to keep the boy as close to the school as possible. Both Yamada and the student snapped towards Aizawa to witness his reaction. It was no secret that the rugged man wasn't fond of taking care of a kid, at least at first. Both wondered if his reaction would be any different from the beginning. But to their surprise, Aizawa didn't huff or sigh. He didn't yell or get mad. He just shrugged his shoulders, letting his hair flop around on his head. All right, whatever you think. False. Oh, wonderful. Nezu cried, simply wonderful. True, both people on the couch were stunned by Aizawa's nonchalant reactions, for very different reasons. But neither made a sound, allowing the principal to continue on with whatever else he wanted to say. One last thing before you go, Tsukachi-san, the rodent began. Yes, said Detective Hummed. I was wondering if Midoriya could tell his situation to you. You know which one I'm talking about, correct? That made the boy pipe up, forgetting his manners. You told him? Nezu chuckled. Why, of course I did. This doesn't mean I don't believe you, but you can't blame me for wanting some solid confirmation. True, the teen faltered. Is this going to be recorded? It isn't, Tsukachi spoke up. It's just for security's sake. He took a long gulp as Nezu gestured for him to begin. Sure, it wasn't going to be recorded, but his mind still found paranoia to latch onto. Even though he knew his story was entirely true, Midoriya was still nervous about messing up or doing something that would make his statements come off as false. It was a weak argument, but fear and paranoia made it grow exponentially. But what was he to do other than talk? Not wanting to talk would only make him seem more guilty or suspicious. So mustering up all the remaining courage he had left, he let his secret escape his mouth. My powers aren't quirk-related. True. Hearing nothing from any adult, he looked up for instructions. He caught Nezu just making another small motion with his paw, and so he continued. I am the Grim Reaper. False. Kami gave his successor a hard glare. Tsukachi interrupted. That was a lie. Midoriya started to sweat. Well, I'm not technically the Grim Reaper. Twa more like an embodiment of death. But two was afraid that wouldn't make as sense if I phrased it like that. True. That registered as true. The detective fixed. You can continue. He let out a sigh of relief, the stress fading from his shoulders as he detensed. Gami was the previous death, and I technically inherited my powers from him. True. Can you elaborate on that? Tsukachi asked. The teen knew exactly what to say, as he had been skimping out on information in an attempt to make his claims easier to understand. Well, each D-Death has a set of powers they are given once they begin the job. Since Gami retired and I became the new death, 2 got the powers he once had. I guess that's not really inheriting them. True. All right, but can I ask a question? The man inquired. Sure, sir. What do you do as death? Do you go out and take souls? No, the boy cried, resorting to his rambling. I don't kill people. I decide where their soul goes once they die. I'm not responsible for anyone's death unless I kill them myself. Like a villain or something. True. I'm assuming that's all you needed to know, Nezu-san? Tsukachi wanted to clarify. Indeed. How did it turn out, detective? He chirped. Well, it's all true, whether you want to believe it or not. The principal tilted his head almost innocently. I believed it from the very beginning. I just wanted to make sure. True. Neither Aizawa nor Yamada had said a word. Yamada was the most silent, surprisingly. But he was busy taking in all this fairly new information. He was the one most out of the loop after all. Tsukachi walked over to the front door, grabbing his matching hat off the hook and beginning to turn the doorknob. I've got to go get this recording to the station, so I'll be off, the overcoat-wearing man stated. I assume this won't be the last time we meet over a matter like this, so goodbye for now. Stay safe, Tsukachi-san, the rodent called with a cheery tone. See you, Tsuka, Eraserhead remarked for the first time in a while, his voice a bit hoarse. Later, Tsukachi, present Mike cried, his announcer personality making the call even more dramatic. Bye, sir. Midoriya felt it would be rude not to say goodbye, even if the detective's presence made his heart skip one too many beats. The tall man waved, but didn't stick around for long as he swung open the door and walked out. He pulled the door closed behind him and was gone. Only then did the teen release a breath he had no idea he was holding. I really did not enjoy that experience. The boy couldn't agree more, though he had the sickening feeling it may not exactly be over. Although Tsukachi departed from the household, one rodent principal remained, sitting eerily still on the oversized armchair. His head was cocked to the side, like some curious street animal. And when Midoriya made the unfortunate mistake of making eye contact, he smiled so uncomfortably that he felt the strongest desire to shrink in on himself. He noticed a set of paws clasped on Nezu's lap, as if he were waiting for something or on something. And while part of him hoped whatever the principal wanted was resolved quickly enough for him to leave already, he couldn't help but also wish for that desire to never come. Though, when Aizawa and Yamada finally realized they still had one more guest in their house, he resorted back to hoping the matter would end as quickly as possible. I hate to bother you all once more, Nezu smiled, though it came off conniving rather than comforting as he intended, though maybe he didn't exactly intend for it to be comforting in the first place. But I wanted to speak with Midoriya privately before I left. Of course, if that's all right. Was it wrong to wish he could scream no? Was it wrong to wish he could just scurry off and lock himself in his room? Even if he was locking himself in with Lynx, that would be such a better alternative than whatever hell he'd have to go through now. There was a small inkling of him that wished one of the heroes would tell Nezu it was getting late. Tell Nezu that he could talk with him some other time. Or maybe even not at all. But he knew that would never happen. It was all wishful thinking. It was always wishful thinking. And it never hurt to wish until it did. Yamada sent back his own smile, though his actually accomplished its purpose of bringing warmth. Of course, if the little listener doesn't mind, we can wait out in our bedroom. It was sort of nice for the voice hero to offer him a say like that. But it was more bittersweet than anything else, because it didn't really matter in the end. It didn't really matter as the pros stood up anyway. It didn't really matter as they walked away without waiting for a response. It didn't really matter as their bedroom door creaked open and then clicked shut. It was kind of funny how Nezu leaned back into his chair relaxed just as Gami moved up to stand protectively in front of his side. I do apologize about occupying your time further, Midoriya. The mammal admitted with only the slightest hint of concern in his words. I just had a few questions for you that I never had the chance to ask in the days before. He only nodded in return, unable to trust his true thoughts to not bleed into his words. Tommy growled, and the teen was thankful in that moment that his mentor could not be heard. But when the rodent sat up from his relaxed position, taking on a much more serious attitude, Midoriya wasn't so sure he wanted to hear what he had to say anymore. Nezu's little black nose twitched ever so slightly, reminding his audience how despite everything, he was still an animal above all else. An animal trying to understand the nature of humanity. Has Bakugo always been that aggressive towards you? For a moment, Midoriya drew the largest blank he had ever recalled, which was contradictory enough on its own. What was Nezu talking about? When was Nezu talking about? Who was Nezu talking about? He hadn't even realized how long he simply sat there in silence and worked against the words that eventually came out. Well, I guess. But it's really not as bad as you think, he rushed to spit out. We grew up together, went to school together, of course he'd be a bit more. The words died on his tongue, dropping dead like they'd been shot point blank. He couldn't bring himself to finish that statement. And to be honest, he didn't really want to. It was such an obvious lie. He'd just be wasting his breath. It'd practically be an insult to every breath he'd taken in his life. Maybe Nezu understood that too, because he didn't make him finish. I thought so. It was quite obvious to tell his personality even before coming to UA. During the entrance exam, the principal reaffirmed, though it was equally obvious to see his personal grudge towards you during the battle training exercise hosted by All Might. The battle training exercise. Of course, why was he even surprised that Nezu knew that at this point? It was practically a given that the principal would be briefed about one student almost killing another. But Bakugo didn't mean to kill him, or Uraraka or Ida. There was no way he'd risk his position at UA by doing something as stupid as that. But he did, and that didn't make any sense. It was completely contradictory to everything the blonde had worked for to get here. It just didn't make any sense, and no amount of explaining could help him understand. He was sent spiraling back into his thoughts from earlier, reassessing every moment leading up to his fall from the edge of the floor. Bakugo was pretty aggressive the entire time, so much so that it took everything out of him just to keep up. It was only luck that he managed to get away and fall back with Uraraka. But that was besides the point. The point was that Bakugo had been fairly normal, in an albeit terrifying way, up until he fired at the trio right at the end. Maybe someone like All Might looking in from the outside wouldn't have seen a difference, but to Midoriya, who had known the blonde since childhood, it was completely out of character. Bakugo was extremely intelligent, more than smart enough to understand the implications and consequences of that final shot, and even if he was flooded with emotion, which was most of the time, he had self-control, that same self-control he'd witnessed when Bakugo apologized to him after the sludge villain incident. At least, he was pretty sure that was an apology. So for him to ignore every brain cell in his body and take that shot, and fire off that explosion, the boy just knew that something was terribly wrong. And then his mind trailed off even further, still where he was thinking earlier, to punishment, to expulsion, and the subsequent panic was enough to send him flying back to reality. He hadn't realized how much he had curled in on himself, or how silent the air was since Nezu's previous words. He looked up hesitantly, locking eyes with the principal in front of him, something he never would have done in a million years. You aren't going to expel him, are you? Everyone seemed particularly caught off guard by that statement. Gami snapped towards him, and though the ghost's face was hidden, Midoriya could still tell his aghast expression. What? You cannot possibly want to defend him? And as for Nezu, he simply cocked his head like a curious scientist examining an unexpected development. The teen could definitely feel himself under a microscope, being prodded at in hopes of producing a reaction. And that's why he said nothing to Gami, make no sound, no movement. He wasn't going to give the reaction he knew the rodent was waiting for. Oh, though, this was Nezu he was talking about. Of course he would press forward regardless. You don't believe I should? That is quite odd to hear from you considering what I believe to be your relationship with him. Midoriya already knew how strange this sounded coming from him, especially in defense of Bakugo, but he didn't need Nezu restating that for him. In fact, he knew that anyone on the outside would agree with the mammal. Hell, even Gami, who was the closest to the inside that someone could possibly get. But his mentor was biased, having disliked the fiery blonde from the start, as well as being especially protective of him. And Midoriya wasn't particularly fond of Bakugo either, though his actions right now certainly didn't go to prove that. Maybe it really was childhood naivety, because admitting that he still respected Bakugo and his potential for heroism sounded so weird, even for him. Regardless of where the motivation came from. However, he felt such a strong responsibility to do all within his power to fix this, because he knew something was wrong, and he'd be damned if he just allowed whatever universal mistake it was to play out unresolved. I know our relationship isn't the best example of childhood friendship. That was an understatement, and even he knew it. But I know Bakugo better than anyone else, and I know that what happened during the battle training exercise wasn't him. Beside him, Gami seemed even more flabbergasted. But Nezu looked intrigued, like Midoriya was some complex puzzle he was trying to put together with his eyes alone. I'm not sure I understand, the principal pushed. I know Bakugo isn't particularly tame by any standards, but he would never do something this reckless, this stupid. Again, Midoriya found himself repeating his thoughts, trying to decipher how he was so certain the blonde would never do something like this, though he would never. Just know. But he had, and that's what puzzled the teen the most. He felt his brain tearing itself apart trying to come up with a plausible answer, but the more he thought about it, the less it seemed to fit, like it simply had been forced upon him all of a sudden. He just couldn't make sense of it all. If he had been paying just a bit more attention, maybe he would have seen the way Nezu stared at his perplexed form. Maybe he would have also seen the bewildered look in his beady black eyes, like the gears weren't quite turning for the rodent either. Maybe he would have seen the sadistic smile that pulled contradictory at his cheeks, like he was enjoying the mystery presented before him. But the boy never got a chance to. As Nezu hopped off the couch and reset his face to its usual nonchalant yet cheery appearance, Midoriya looked up from his lap at the soft thud, only to lock eyes again with the mammal. And though his face looked as it typically did, he couldn't stop himself from seeing some inkling of worry in the solid black eyes that stared back at him. The well-being of my students is my most important focus at all times, I can assure you, Midoriya. The principal gave a little nod after that. I do apologize once more for taking up your time, and for having to depart so hastily, but I do appreciate the insight. The teen wasn't really focused after that, barely hearing Nezu walk to the hallway and call out goodbyes to Aizawa and Yamada, or approach the front door promptly like Tsukachi did. He barely heard the doorknob jiggle as it was unlocked or the hinges squeak as it was open, but he did manage to catch Nezu calling out to him one last time before leaving. I do have the feeling we'll be seeing each other soon, but for now, do take care of yourself, Midoriya. You're certainly one of the most promising students I've seen through my doors, and it would be a shame if you allowed yourself to get hung up on this incident. Before he could even attempt to say anything else, the principal was out the door, and it was closed behind. The boy let out a breathy sigh he hadn't even realized he was holding and sank back into the couch just as he heard the master bedroom door open. Somehow, he found himself even less reassured than before, but that was to be expected from an individual like Nezu. Though, he could assure himself of one thing. The thought wouldn't be leaving his mind anytime soon. That night was sleepless for Midoriya. He tossed and turned uncontrollably, as if he was fighting off a villain in his dreams. There were a lot of things that caused his restlessness. The events that had transpired just before in the living room certainly being at the top of that list. But surprisingly, something about Link's being in the room made him uncomfortable too. Just the fact that someone else's eyes were upon him made him feel uneasy, even if it was just a kitten. Gami was a different story. He wasn't sure if the specter slept at all at night, but he knew that the man did watch him. For some reason, that fact never bothered him. Maybe it was because he subconsciously allowed the ghost permission to watch him while he slept. Maybe it was because the spirit was the only person he truly trusted. Who knows? He certainly did not. All he could confirm was that Gami was an exception to his paranoia, and thankfully so. The morning sun didn't hit him this morning, since the ghost couldn't open the curtains of the guest room. The teen was woken from his few moments of sleep by the phantom feeling of ice-cold water being splashed on him. Of course, once he jumped out from under the covers, he found himself completely dry. Still, chills washed over him as if he had just gotten out of the shower. He yanked open the curtains himself, his cold awakening turning his mood sour. Gami looked over as he rubbed his eyes awake. "Someone is cranky this morning," he teased. "Be quiet," the boy quipped back jokingly. But the slight undertone of crankiness was still audible. The spirit smothered a chuckle, but it came out like a snorted laugh. There weren't many times where Gami laughed, so the few times he did, it was like the sun shined only for him. His moodiness faded away as the corners of his mouth turned into a smile. Midoriya brought a hand to his mouth, but couldn't help but laugh as well. One laugh grew into two. Soon the duo were snickering by the bed like gossiping schoolgirls over something as mundane as waking up. The teen finally calmed his laughter down before it became too loud. Swinging his legs off the side of the bed, he hopped out carefully to change. Trudging towards the closet, he pulled out his spare turtleneck and sweatbands that he took with him to UA, putting them on now instead. He still hadn't gotten any of his stuff from home, despite now having spent a few days at the Aizawa Yamada household. All he really had in terms of clothing was his UA uniform and that spare set of clothes in the closet, both of which had to be washed each day so he could keep using them. Yamada had given him a set of worn loungewear that had once belonged to Aizawa to use as pajamas, since he didn't have any. Midoriya was apprehensive at first, not wanting to upset the constantly tired pro, but Present Mike insisted and eventually he gave in. He slipped on both the turtleneck and the baggy sweatbands before closing the closet door. It was still early in the morning, obvious by the rising dawn. He had no idea who was up and who wasn't, but he hoped everyone else was asleep. Being the first one up was sort of a safety net for him, as it allowed him to avoid any surprise encounters. The boy grasped the doorknob quietly and gave it a gentle turn. With a soft click, the door opened just wide enough for him to fit through. He didn't want to take the chance of pulling it open further and having the hinges squeak, but he squeezed himself through and made his way to the living room without a sound. He sat down on the couch, alone. Both the living room and the kitchen were empty. Midoriya's stomach growled and his mind yearned for entertainment, but he dared not touch any more food or the TV remote. Thankfully, he had his notebook underarm before he left the guest room, and that would be more than enough to entertain him. He scribbled away in the book, just revising and adding to notes that were already there. Kami slipped in comments here and there, but the two stayed relatively quiet as to not wake anyone up. That never ended well for him back at home. There was a sudden creak in the floor, and both of the deathly duo shot up. The teen's heart dropped to his stomach, sure he had been caught. But how? He was sure he'd been quiet, so who had woken up? The ghost flew around the corner, open to scouting out the situation. He peeked his head out from around the wall, staring down into the hallway. After a few moments of silence, the spirit returned to Midoriya's side by the couch. The boy looked up at him confused. So, Kami shrugged. False alarm. What? What do you mean false alarm? The ghost shushed him rudely and pointed towards the hall. Like clockwork, another creak echoed from beyond the hallway. Midoriya grew nervous at the small sounds, his heart thumping in his chest. His mentor hadn't seen anyone, so where were those noises coming from? His hands grew sweaty as soft footsteps came closer and closer. The steps seemed sneaky and deliberate. If it was Aizawa or Yamada, why didn't they just announce themselves? He was loud enough for anyone to hear him from the hallway. What if it wasn't either hero? Was it an intruder? A villain? He contemplated the thought of having to defend himself so early in the morning. He braced himself for whatever would meet his eyes, friend or foe. He visibly crumbled in confusion when a small gray paw strutted out from behind the wall. He heaved out a sigh at realizing he had overreacted. Kami cocked his head, wondering how he had missed the small feline. Link strolled out from the hall like he owned the world, eyes closed, tail wagging. It was almost as if the kitten had earbuds in, and was swaying like he was listening to music. The cheery cat made his way all the way to the center of the living room before opening his eyes, and once he realized he was being watched, quickly scrambled to the corner of the living room, curling into himself to make him appear smaller. Midoriya's heart hurt at the sight. Well, I was certainly not expecting that. But the teen simply ignored his friend. He seemed so sad. Did I do something wrong? Kami paused. I do not think so. He just seems afraid of humans. Afraid of humans, he repeated, brows furrowing. The ghost realized his successor had never handled an animal before, so he was pretty in the dark on the subject. Yes, sometimes it is because of paranoia. Sometimes it is because of previous trauma. But just as you can be afraid of cats, cats can be afraid of humans. The boy's face soured and he turned defensive. I'm not afraid of cats. I'm just afraid I'll hurt them. All animals for that matter. He turned towards the shaking kitten in the corner, and his heartstrings tugged. Was this how he seemed? All scared and alone. He felt a longing to help, but really didn't know how. What if that were me? What would I want someone to do? Pulling his legs up off the floor, he laid them along the couch, shifting his body. He turned away from Link's hiding in the corner. His head now faced towards the kitchen and away from the scared feline. I'm not looking anymore, he spoke softly, still without eye contact. See. He then buried his head into his notebook and started revising his notes again. He made sure to keep his eyes away from the cat. He gestured for Kami to turn away as well, unsure if the kitten could tell the ghost was watching him. But the spirit listened, and soon, both were fully engrossed back into the notebook, quietly laughing and chatting. Then, as quiet as it was, both individuals heard a small step on the hardwood. It was almost undetectable, but both were waiting for it. Like clockwork. There was another step, and another, until the tiny paws sounded as if they were dancing upon the floor. Midoriya felt a small smile form on his lips as he listened to the little cat move around. He was sure that Lynx had walked out of the corner by now and was somewhere in the center of the room. It certainly didn't feel like much, but the small yips that came afterwards warmed his heart. Maybe he couldn't touch the kitten, but this he could do. Surprisingly, neither Aizawa nor Yamada had too much of a reaction at seeing him up so early. Eraserhead had gotten up less than an hour after he had. Present Mike, on the other hand, slept in until much later. On a more unfortunate note, the minute the rugged man had walked into the room, Lynx had huddled up in the corner again. And once the blonde entered, that sent the kitten running back to the guest room for good. Midoriya felt a bit of despair eat away at him while listening to frantic paws against hardwood. But there wasn't much more he could do. It was around noon, when the teen heard a jingle of keys being taken off their hook. He had remained in the living room despite the awakening of both adults in the household. just moving himself to the smaller armchair near the corner of the room instead. He looked up snapily from his notebook, eyes locking onto Aizawa's form, taking a single key from off a hook. Yamada too was interested, watching him from the kitchen island instead. The homeroom teacher spun the key around his finger lazily, then making his way to the living room. "What is that? Show." Yamada voiced both his and the boy's thoughts. He flashed the slab of metal at his partner. "Tsukachi gave me this yesterday. It's a key to Inko Midoriya's house." "What? A key to his home? Why would the detective give that to Aizawa?" He put down his notebook, letting it rest on his lap. Gami moved from staring out the window to back to his side. Both were listening intently, expecting the two heroes to keep talking. But shockingly, the underground hero turned to him instead. "Tsukachi gave me this so we could pick up whatever stuff you needed from home," he explained. "We could do that today if you're up to it, problem child." "You could finally get extra clothing," Gami remarked. That was true. But other than that, there wasn't much else he wanted. His notebooks definitely, and his plants if they let him take those, but that was practically it. He really wished he could go alone, but he wasn't going to argue with Aizawa. Besides, he really wanted to wear his own pajamas for a change. "That sounds fine," he whispered, but both heroes caught it. "All right," the hero replied. "We'll leave in a little bit." Midoriya nodded and lifted himself off the couch, leaving for the guest room to put his notebook away. He remembered that Lynx was probably in here, hoping for some solitude. He paused at the door, wondering what he should do. What if that were me? What would I want someone to do? He gave the door a soft knock, letting the sound ring out. "Hey Lynx," he spoke to seemingly no one. "It's just me. Izuku, can I come in to put my notebook away?" He must have seemed so silly, asking a cat for permission to enter a room, but then, a small meow came from inside the guest room. The team looked at Gami, thinking he just imagined that. "I think that means you can enter." Turning back to the door, he gave a small shrug and twisted the knob. Deciding he would be quick, he slinked inside and placed the book down onto the desk. He left the room quickly and closed the door behind him, not staying behind long enough to hear a tiny goodbye meow. Re-entering the living room, he slipped on his signature red sneakers and stood by the front door patiently. He didn't want to track dirt into the living room just to sit on the couch, plus he was fine standing. Neither Aizawa nor Yamada was in his line of sight, so he figured the two were in their own rooms. And just like he guessed, he heard a door open and close, then watched Present Mike make his way down the hall. The man was dressed in casual clothing, wearing a pair of light wash jeans with a dark jean jacket to match. His burgundy undershirt stood out and his hair was pulled up into a half bun. He had swapped out his normal triangular glasses for a pair of rectangular ones. He was fairly startled at seeing Midoriya just waiting by the front door. "Goodness, little listener," he sighed. "I didn't know you were waiting on us." The teen faltered. He wasn't trying to rush them. "Chu just didn't want you guys to wait on me like last time. You don't have to feel bad about that," Yamada tried to reassure. "I sprung that onto you pretty last minute." But before the boy could try and refute that, Aizawa came down the hallway, pretty much killing the conversation. He was dressed similarly to Midoriya, with a long-sleeved black shirt and a pair of dark gray sweatpants. His hair was loose and messy, still with a few tangles in it. "All right," he interrupted unknowingly. "Are you two ready?" Both nodded in confirmation, so the rugged man opened the front door and grabbed his car keys. They loaded up the same way they had on the way to the vet, with Aizawa and Yamada in the front and Midoriya in the back seat. Gami trailed behind, but didn't bother waiting for the car to start. He already knew how to get to his successor's home from here, so he figured he'd meet them there. The teen watched his ghostly companion leave without him, and wished he could go with him. But alas, the car engine started up and soon enough, the three headed off towards the Midoriya home. Yamada nodded off about halfway into the drive, his light snoring filling up the cabin. The boy wasn't too sure how long they had been driving, but since the subway from UA to his house was about 40 minutes, he expected the drive to be a bit longer. Neither him nor Aizawa had spoken a word since they left, and quite honestly, he was all right with that. It felt lonely without Gami, and he didn't remember if he had ever been separated from the spirit for this long. His eyes were constantly at the window, just hoping he'd spot the man's figure somewhere. His mind oddly drifted back to the small kitten he had left in the guest room. Midoriya wondered what Lynx was doing. He was sure the cat was fine, since he probably enjoyed the empty house more. Maybe he was relaxing on the couch, or maybe playfully dancing on the living room floors. It was an unusual thing that brought a smile to his face, but he found himself stifling a giggle at the thought. Or here came his homeroom teacher's voice, sending him out of his head and back to reality. Sure enough, when he poked his head out, he could see the familiar structure of his house from a distance, almost taunting him. Aizawa pulled into the driveway, which was empty, and put the car in park. "Hey, Zashi," he attempted to wake his partner up by shaking him lightly. "We're here already." The blond man groaned loudly and stretched his arms out, nearly whacking his husband in the face. Not really saying anything coherent, he opened his car door and stepped out groggily, eyes squinting from the sunlight. Midoriya figured he could get out as well, since the two heroes had already. Looking around, he found no sign of Gami. Had the ghost not arrived yet? That thought made him frown. Eraserhead slid the key into the lock on the front door and gave it a rough twist. The lock clicked out of place and the teacher shoved the door hard. It opened with ease and everyone walked inside. Midoriya got in first and then found someone familiar. "There you are," he cried. Gami turned to face his successor from the couch. He was currently laying down on it. "I can sit once more," he yelled back uncharacteristically. The teen laughed and rushed over to the sofa. Then, without warning, he threw himself down on it, right on top of his mentor. The ghost groaned, not expecting the extra weight, but he didn't complain. Both quickly turned to laughter, just happy to be in a moment that seemed homey. They completely forgot about the other two heroes also in the room in their bliss. Swinging his head around, the boy opened his tightly clenched eyes to meet the deadpan look of his teachers, quickly losing his laughter for embarrassment. Sorry, he tried to explain. "It's just that Gami's here and he can't really sit on the couches at your house. But that's only because it takes time and practice and he already knows how to sit on this coup." "It's fine, problem child," Aizawa interrupted. "You can stop rambling." That shut him up quick. And Midoriya got off the couch, now feeling mortified. Yamada elbowed his partner in the side. Not enough to stir a reaction out of him, but just enough to sting. The teen shuffled his fingers together, then pointed towards a door down the hall. "That's my room," he announced awkwardly. The blonde took a step forward. Nodding, "Do you need help getting your things?" "That would be great," he whispered. He did a 180 and began walking to his room, with the heroes following close behind. "I'm going to stay here if that is all right," Gami called out from the couch still. "No problem, Gami," he answered back, stating the spirit's name so the adults behind him wouldn't get confused. Finally reaching his door, he twisted the handle and watched it click open. Inside was the small sanctuary he dearly missed. Taking a few slow steps, he embraced the warm serenity of being surrounded by his plants. Aizawa and Yamada grew curious when no words came from the teen, so they both peeked inside. The room was pretty bare on its own. There was a small bed by the window and a desk against the wall. Beside the desk were two thin bookcases. But the furniture was definitely not the focus of the room. No, it was most certainly the remarkable displays of greenery all over the room. The bookshelves were full of potted plants, ranging from small flowers to long-stemmed leaves and succulents. The pots containing them were a wide array of colors and shapes. Some were even mason jars. Both men were in absolute awe. Midoriya didn't seem to realize his teachers were inside the room yet, too focused on his plants to care. His eyes settled on a specific bunch of red flowers and paled at their condition. "My spider lilies," he cried out in shock, rushing over to them. He stroked their wilting petals gently with his gloved fingers, careful not to break them off. Their red hue wasn't as vibrant and the leaves drooped down sadly. He knew he hadn't been here to water them for a few days, but still wasn't expecting his plants to be in such critical condition. Yamada was concerned over the outburst, but realized what the cry was about upon walking in. "Whoa, I didn't know you gardened, little listener." The boy turned around in surprise. "Ooh yeah, it's just something I picked up." "Well, these are beautiful," he yelled out with pizzazz. That made Midoriya bashful, and he moved away from the lilies to focus on his other things. He quickly piled his notebooks on his desk, making two neat stacks. Then moving to his closet, he took everything off its racks. There wasn't much in there to begin with, so he had no problem folding it all and laying that down on the desk as well. Aizawa had come inside during the light chaos and observed all of the stuff now organized on the desk. While it wasn't a lot, it was certainly enough to require some sort of help. "Do you have some sort of suitcase you can put that all in?" Eraserhead asked while gesturing at the desk. "Two don't," he stuttered. "That's fine," Yamada interjected. "We can just carry it to the trunk." Aizawa grumbled, but complied as the English teacher and the student both grabbed a small pile of clothes. Together, the three quickly managed to load up the trunk in just a few minutes. Midoriya walked back into his room, scoping it out to make one last check. His numerous potted plants stared back at him tauntingly and he wished he could bring them along. Yamada followed him in as well. "Aren't you going to take your plants?" the announcer questioned. "Toucan," the normally quiet teen exclaimed in surprise and happiness. "Of course," he loudly yelled back. "They're too nice to leave behind. Makes me want to go, yeah." But Midoriya only caught the confirmation and rushed over to the bookshelves. Quickly, yet carefully, he picked up the pots and jars and placed them down on his now cleared desk. His greenery was important to him, a little hobby that had grown into so much more, no pun intended. Raising sprouts into luscious leaves and petals helped him distress from the pressures of his job. Besides, it made him feel at home and safe. He couldn't wait to decorate the guest room with his bushels of greens. Carefully moving the spider lilies, he grasped them tightly as to not shake their fragile, wilting leaves. Who would have guessed these little flowers would have been the start of something spectacular? He sure didn't. But there was no way he would just give up on them and let them die. And so the teen couldn't wait to restore them to their former beauty. Maybe then would the guest room finally start to feel like his own. Midoriya woke up to the slivers of daylight peeking through his window, his curtains partially drawn. This was the first morning that the guest room actually felt like his room. The large bookshelf in the room was stacked with his potted plants, the greenery filling the space with a familiar warmth. His notebooks were on the bottom shelf, some still piled on the previously empty desk. The ceramic plates from Ishihara's were also on the bottom shelf, and right next to them was his inheritance. The beautiful brown chess box lay daintily next to those plates, with the recipe book right on top. The antique silver kettle still remained in the cardboard box that he had brought it home in, the teen still unsure of where to place it. Gami floated around his successor as he lifted himself out of bed. The ghost peered inside the closet from behind once it was open. The closet no longer looked sparse and sad, and was now filled with pretty much all of his clothes. Unfortunately, that still wasn't much, mostly battered shirts and worn shorts. And even though it may have seemed a little bit selfish, the spirit hoped the heroes would indulge the boy. At the very least get him some more clothing. The morning was still fairly early, but nonetheless Midoriya changed quickly into his school uniform. He didn't bother turning on the overhead lights, simply using the breaking light of dawn to illuminate his room. In the darkness, he couldn't tell where Lynx was, but he just hoped he was staying far enough away from the small feline. Ever since picking the cats up, Lynx had been basically confined to the guest room along with him. It was all in efforts to help the kitten work through his oddly paranoid behavior, but so far, it didn't seem to be working. It had only been a few days though, so the heroes hadn't given up just yet. The teen really didn't know how long it took to heal such skittish behavior like that, but he assumed it was long and tedious. Sneakily, he opened his bedroom door and tiptoed out into the hall. It was still early enough that he was the first one up, so in a desperate effort to not wake up any of the adults, he moved quietly to the living room. Throwing himself down onto the couch, he snuggled up into the armrest. The whole reason he was even up this early was to sort souls for his job and all, but he was feeling sluggish and unmotivated. He had been pushing himself lately to stay on track with his work, but with all of the emotional baggage he'd been carrying around, most days felt eerily dull. But today would be different, at least that was what the boy was telling himself. He had been idly sitting on the couch for nearly 5 minutes, comfortably curled into the armrest still, but he forced himself to sit up straight and get to work finally. Finally going to get started? The ghost teased. Midoriya looked at him narrowly, but replied, yeah, no need to bug me about it, unless you want to help. He chuckled hard, but only his successor could hear that. When have I not? Giving a sassy eye roll, he swiped his hand close to his mentor, summoning the flames right in his face. Sometimes, the teen would make the flames appear just to watch them burn. It was calming, in a way, to see his work when he wasn't under pressure. They were such an odd color compared to typical fire, and the way they waved in the non-existent wind was mesmerizing. But today was unfortunately not a day he could slack off, maybe later, but certainly not now. One by one, the little puffs of light slowly made themselves visible throughout the living room. They resembled what one would believe stars looked like up close. Midoriya cupped the dimmest one he could spot, and quickly got to work. With every soul he sent away, the boy grew more and more somber. When he first started doing this, his intention was to record the details of each and every person that passed through his fingertips. But he quickly realized it would be too time-consuming and depressing. But still, he wished there was a way for him to remember all of the different lives he witnessed each day, as well as quell his guilt of not saving them, even if it was impossible. So instead, he reassured them that he would become an amazing hero, maybe not number one, but certainly a marvelous hero, before he sent a soul away. He promised he would save another life in return. Who do you have there? Gami asked, breaking the silence. You have been holding that one for a while now. Snapping out of his stupor, the teen turned to look at his mentor. He tossed the soul to his other hand, using his now free right hand to deny the ghost's previous statement. No, I've just been thinking. That still does not answer my question. That made Midoriya roll his eyes again, but nonetheless he responded. Her name is Nagano-ko, if it interests you so much. That is a classic name, though a pretty one. Can you tell me more? Midoriya wondered why the spirit was so interested in this particular person, but he entertained Gami's curiosity. She was a college student studying modern art. She was really good at painting. Died of a sudden heart attack though. Gami hummed in contemplation, seemingly pondering something. His hand drifted to the gray stone dangling from his neck and his bony fingers stroked it carefully. The boy focused on the oval-shaped rock. The strange, black swirls had always tugged at the back of his mind, and he often wondered where they came from. But the way his mentor fed into the silence made him wonder if he was remembering something from his past. "Did you know her?" "I don't know how, since you two weren't alive at the same time, but—" He voiced his thoughts aloud. No, I do not know who she is," the specter explained. The teen pressed for more. "So what is it?" Gami waved the pendant around his neck, wiggling the rope between his fingers. "Something about the painting. That feels familiar." "Like what kind of familiar?" "I do not really." The ghost flinched heavily, cradling his head in his skinny hands. Midoriya jumped from the couch, completely abandoning his job in favor of his friend. He wasn't sure what was going on, but the man's actions reminded him of when he had a migraine before and after a premonition. He whispered his frantic concerns, but it didn't seem like his mentor could hear him. Gami couldn't hear any of his successor's cries through the deep throbbing in his head. It felt as if someone was drilling a jackhammer into his non-existent skull. But even then, there was something almost akin to whispering in the back of his mind. Look, I painted this stone for you." That voice, it felt so familiar, but he couldn't quite pin who it was. It was high-pitched, feminine, definitely not the tone of his successor. Besides, it was way too young to be the boy's. The voice had to belong to a young girl, around 6 or 7 years old. "Do you like it?" Then, the headache stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. He could now hear the world around him, and the desperate cries finally reached his ears. "Sorry to worry you, I am all right," he reassured. "Gami, what was that?" Midoriya was not convinced. That's never happened before. He contemplated lying to the teen, but realized that would accomplish practically nothing. There was no real reason to keep this from him, so why did he feel the urge to do so? Nonetheless, he shook it off and swallowed his anxiety. "I do not know," he started. "There was a voice in my head, and I recognized it. But other than understanding it was a female child, I do not remember who it was." That seemed to shock the normally reserved boy. "Anything else?" "What did the voice say?" "She told me that she painted this stone." Gami fumbled said stone between his fingers. "For me." Well, that certainly explained the swirls and specks away, but only raised more questions. Who was this girl? What was her connection to the spirit? What was the reason behind the rock that hung from his neck? There was one thing that stuck though. His wordplay earlier somehow triggered this repressed memory back into the limelight. If that was true, could all of Gami's memories be recovered? Was there a way for the ghost to remember his past again? "This is promising though," the boy assured. "If we can trigger your subconscious like that again, you might be able to remember more stuff." The transparent man nodded confidently, eager to recover more of his past. He had no idea why he couldn't remember his life before retiring. Even his time as death was foggy, with only miscellaneous, minuscule memories remaining. Although he was excited to continue gaining his memories back, he knew that right now his successor should be working, not worrying over him. Well, we can worry about this later. He was going to get his boy back on track, whether he wanted to or not. "You need to finish up. It is almost time for Eraserhead and Present Mike to wake up." "You're right, I didn't even realize it was this late." He plopped himself back down onto the couch and leaned into the cushions, reaching for another puff of light. Gami too cupped a dimming soul in his hands, holding onto it until his successor was ready. He moved a bit closer to the couch, his side tangibly resting against the armrest. But neither he nor Midoriya realized that. It wasn't long before both heroes awoke from their slumber. Though it would have normally been surprising, both men were thoroughly used to seeing the young boy up and dressed before them. The student had long explained the way his odd behavior connected to his responsibilities, but he assumed it would be a hard pill to swallow without time to adapt. He had pretty much spent the majority of his life alone, so he still wasn't used to people being around him while he was up at home. But it sure didn't take long for both pros to get ready to leave. It was still quite early, but since both were teachers, they had to arrive much earlier than typical students. Of course, he was not a typical student, so he got to UA just as early as the staff. But honestly, the lack of sleep didn't bother him as much as it would another student. His natural sleep deprivation just became a part of his lifestyle, along with many other peculiar tidbits that would seem odd alone. But together, they made up the shambled mess that was his character, so he worked with them as any person would. Midoriya's ears perked up at the quiet jingle of keys, his eyes focusing in on his surroundings. Aizawa was standing by the front door, all decked out in his hero gear. Yamada was leaning on the kitchen island, munching loudly on an apple. It seemed as if everything the voice hero did was intentionally loud and obnoxious, though it could just be part of his nature at this point. But, like clockwork, the boy stood up at the metal jingle and walked over to the mat by the door to slip on his signature red sneakers. Despite however many times the ghost teased him, he would never get rid of those shoes in place of another pair. He had simply grown too attached to them. "Hey little listener," the blonde man called out unexpectedly, showing off another bright, red apple in his hand. "Care for one?" The teen tried his best to eat as little of the hero's food as possible, but he hadn't had anything since he woke up. Normally that wouldn't be enough of a reason for him to accept, but his stomach growled menacingly and he caved. Just as his head nodded slightly, Present Mike tossed the apple lightly at him in an underhanded throw. Despite being shy and reserved, his instincts were as sharp as ever, and he did not hesitate to snap his free-gloved hand up and catch the fruit with ease. The apple was even shinier up close, its pristine, red skin drawing more saliva to the corners of his dry mouth. He didn't get the chance to take the first bite in peace, but he wasn't really expecting to. Besides, the boy had no problem eating and walking at the same time. The school was barely a 15-minute walk away, and so both pros preferred to walk rather than drive. In contrast to his partner, Yamada was still dressed in his casual wear. It was much more likely that he would be recognized in his hero wear than Eraserhead, whose underground status and constant vigilance kept him out of the media spotlight. So the raven-haired man could afford to leave the house in his costume, while the blonde did not have that luxury. Midoriya ended up listening to Gami's quiet ramblings since the entire walk was flooded in nothing but silence. He would whisper back sometimes, but he avoided talking to the spirit when around the heroes because he wasn't sure if they were used to that fact yet. He wasn't sure if either adult was even used to him yet, but that was an entirely different tangent he really didn't want to get into. The trio were only a few minutes away from the hero school when Aizawa spoke up. "Just to let you know, Bakugo will be back in class today." What? Was Aizawa being serious? Bakugo had been suspended from school since the battle training incident, and the classroom had been obnoxiously quiet since his departure. Did that mean that his words had gotten to Nezu? That the principal had been convinced not to expel him? This was Nezu he was talking about, and he seriously doubted that his plea alone was the deciding factor. There had to be some ulterior motive, because Midoriya knew that he did not have the ability to convince Nezu. But he didn't really care what was the principal's turning point, because it was all relieving in the end. Gami had voiced his opinions on the situation a number of times, complaining that the teen should have been expelled, especially after Midoriya found himself vouching for him to Nezu that night. The ghost had made his beliefs more than apparent, but none of that did enough to sway the teen from his own. He would defend Bakugo and his potential even if no one else would, and not because he was some spineless wimp. He held grudges and kept up his paranoid layer at practically all times. He wasn't very trusting and had a difficult time working with others at first. He was a whole mess of social skills, that was for sure. But he knew he had to defend the fiery blonde. He had to because he knew with absolute certainty that something about his reckless and endangering actions that day were wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it. No matter how many times Gami had asked him to explain, he just knew that wasn't Bakugo. His actions were too extreme, too over the top, even for Bakugo. He felt it in his gut, like a thick, obnoxious smell he couldn't get out of his nose, that something peculiar was happening. And the righteousness in him, or at least that's what he attributed it to, wouldn't allow him to sit idly by. Aizawa must have mistaken his silence as some sort of fear, because he attempted to reassure him. "Don't worry too much about it. He'll be taking anger management sessions with Hound Dog, and I'll be watching him closely to make sure he doesn't pull anything as idiotic as that again." That's not what the quiet boy was worried about. In fact, he couldn't really find himself worried about Bakugo's return at all. He was just relieved. It was so strange, being relieved at the return of someone like Bakugo, but he couldn't deny how it eased the storm in his stomach. For some reason, the wrongness he'd been experiencing while the blonde remained absent from class felt so personal, like it was his fault. He'd been such a mess these past few days, a mess of blame and guilt, and he couldn't make sense of any of it. The only thing he could place was this overpowering feeling of ownership. He just didn't know why or how, such is the way of a gut feeling. All he knew was he had to fix it, he just had to. But he had done it, and the relief was so sweet he could die happy in it. As the front entrance of the school came closer in sight, so did what looked to be a mass of people standing by it. This was one of the few times Midoriya was so shocked, he forgot his filter entirely, much less his vow of usual silence. "What in the world?" "Reporters," Eraserhead responded almost instantly. "Damn bloodsuckers." Yamada piped in. "They must have found out All Might was teaching here. I'm surprised it took them so long," his husband added sarcastically. The green-haired teen's attention shot back and forth between the two adults. Currently, they were out of sight from any nosy reporter stares looking their way, as well as out of earshot. But if they got any closer, he was sure they'd be discovered. He wasn't sure if the teachers wanted to just walk through the crowd or not, but he hoped for his sake they'd be taking another entrance. But after a few seconds of back and forth banter, he could contain himself anymore. "So are we going through there or what?" Both turned to stare at him as if he'd grown an extra head. But Yamada spoke up for his husband. "Sho hates reporters, though I'm sure you could already tell." "And I have good reason," said man interrupted. Because of that, Present Mike continued despite the quip. We'll be taking a side entrance inside. Oh, good, Midoriya huffed under his breath, though everyone around him caught the comment due to the silence in the air. But no one mentioned it, preferring to make their way to the side entrance instead. The doorway looked like a general staff entrance. It was no wonder why the reporters weren't here as well. Aizawa pulled out a seemingly normal-looking key and slipped it into the lock. With little effort, he twisted the key into place until it clicked, pushing open the door with ease. They made their way to one of the upper floors and both teachers entered the 1A classroom, even though Yamada's room was further down the hall. The boy plopped his bag down at his desk. It wasn't particularly heavy, but it did feel nice to get off his shoulders. There was still well over an hour until class officially started, and the teen wasn't sure what he would do with all the extra time. The past few days, he'd just sat at his desk and worked on adding details to his notebooks, but he really didn't feel like doing that today. So instead, he strolled over to the window and pressed his gloves against the glass to get a close look. Wow, I didn't realize how many reporters were actually out there, he commented after having gotten a better look at the size of the crowd. They kind of look like ants from up here. Eraserhead took a few steps towards the window as well, but after only a glance, he sighed heavily and turned to the door. I'm going to go see if I can clear them out before the students start arriving. You need me to come help, Yamada called after him, but Aizawa just shook his head. Those leeches will just freak out more if they see you, Zashi. They probably won't know me anyway, so I'll be fine. Present Mike's shoulders slumped. I guess that's true. The tired teacher just nodded solemnly. But that didn't stop his hasty exit of the classroom. Midoriya didn't bother to glance back, just keeping his gaze focused on the small dots by the front entrance of the school. His ears were still trained on the other hero though, but not a sound was made. He is just standing by Eraserhead's desk. Gami seemingly read his thoughts in that moment, but he didn't even nod to confirm the statement. The heavy silence in the classroom made it impossible for the boy to move a muscle, so he just kept staring at the window. The emptiness must have finally got to the blonde pro and he cleared his throat. The quiet teen's head snapped around to look at him, and once the two made eye contact, the announcer decided now was the time to speak up. Do you mind me staying in here for a bit? He asked. I don't really want to head down to my empty classroom just yet. Midoriya didn't answer right away, instead taking a moment to think. He wasn't really asking for his opinion. This was just another one of those formality things. He was supposed to say yes, whether or not he really wanted the hero to stay. If you do not want him to stay, then just say no. The ghost seemed to realize the rut he was in, but his stomach still churned at the thought. All he had to say was yes, so why was it so difficult? Why was he hesitating? He had done this numerous times before without any problems, so why did this time feel so different? Yamada's gaze moved away from the student during the awkward silence, turning towards the door instead. He should just leave. It was obvious the boy didn't want him to stay if he was taking this long to answer. But then, why didn't he just say no? The silence was arguably more disheartening than a simple decline, and easily more uncomfortable. Did he feel obligated to just go with whatever answer he was subconsciously pushing? Actually, now that the hero thought about it, that would explain a lot of Midoriya's behavior over the few days he'd spent with them. The teen always seemed to give the answer that he and Aizawa were looking for, practically agreeing with everything. Yamada wanted to slap himself. Of course his actions were submissive. He came from an abusive and neglectful household. The poor kid probably had to survive by going along with whatever the others around him wanted. The past few days, the pro made an effort to give Midoriya as many choices as possible to help him feel comfortable in his new environment, but that was probably making the problem worse. But it wasn't like he could do the opposite and limit the kid's choices either, so how was he going to fix this? The blonde dropped his head in his hands, feeling like he was right back at square one again. Maybe the best way to start fixing this mess was to just leave. That was what the teen seemed to want anyway. Plus it would give himself a chance to think everything over. So he stood upright from his slouching position, startling the boy in the room, and took a few steps towards the door. But right as he did, he picked up on some heavy-sounding footsteps coming from down the hall. The only person that came to his mind was Semitos, but he usually didn't come until later. He turned towards the reserve student and he too seemed to pick up on the loud tread. They shared a glance of confusion, before watching the color in the boy's face completely melt away. His eyes widened to the size of baseballs, and Present Mike noticed how his hands started to tremble slightly. He looked back towards the classroom doorway to find the cause of his reaction, unprepared for what he saw. Ah, young Midoriya, Yamada, what a surprise. A set of familiar, golden blonde tufts peeked out from the sides of the doorway, along with a chiseled and shadowed face. The man hobbled the rest of his hulking form to the center of the doorway so he could be seen in full. Midoriya almost threw up at the sight of All Might. He never realized how the close proximity to the number one hero made him so uncomfortable. He could make out a low growl from the spirit next to him, but the echoing in his head drowned out most everything else. You need to be realistic. No. He had gotten past this already. He could become a hero. He was going to become a hero. He had made so much progress so far, he couldn't let a chance encounter with All Might send him back to the starting line. Present Mike had no idea why the teen behind him looked so sickly at the sight of All Might, so he treaded carefully. "You're here early, All Might." The burly man laughed. "Indeed I am. Had a bit of extra time on my hands, so I figured I'd get here early for a change." The announcer chuckled uncomfortably, his peripheral vision allowing him to see Midoriya still looked afraid. The number one hero didn't seem to realize anything was wrong, laughing loudly. All Might cleared his throat, wheezing slightly, and brought his large hand out as a gesture. "It's lucky I caught you here, young Midoriya. I've been meaning to speak with you." That made multiple stomachs in the room drop. "Would you head to the teacher's lounge with me? I'm afraid it's a private matter." Thami immediately interjected. "You do not have to. Just say no." But how was he supposed to say no to the number one hero? Sure, he had done it that one time 10 months ago, but that was in a moment of unrestrained rage. Right now, he knew nothing but fear. You need to be realistic. He tried to breathe normally, but his thoughts were swirling around uncontrollably, like a hurricane. His erratic heartbeat was impossible to follow or match with his gloves. He felt like throwing up and wheezing at the same time, but his pure panic only let him quietly hyperventilate. There just isn't any other way. Why did All Might want to talk with him? Was he going to punish him for his language during that encounter? Was he going to kick him out of UA? If anyone could do that, surely the number one hero could. All Might could definitely squash his hero career if he wanted to. You're not going to be able to get anywhere when your records say quirkless. You'll just be spinning in circles until you've lost all the energy to keep going. He had told All Might that he didn't have a quirk that day. And while it wasn't a lie, it was certainly dangerous information. What if that was what All Might wanted to talk about? The pro had seen him fight during the training exercise a few days ago, and he sure didn't look quirkless. He had already spilled his secret to multiple heroes. Nezu, Aizawa, Yamada, and Recovery Girl all knew. He wouldn't allow his secret to get out to anyone else, much less All Might of all people. "I can see your potential, and that's why I'm offering you my quirk." Hell, just the fact that it's my quirk should have you excited. Was this about All Might's quirk? He hadn't told anyone about the little he figured out about it, not even the other heroes or teachers. He wasn't going to take the chance of spilling to Aizawa or Yamada if they didn't know about it, regardless of whether they worked with him. Did All Might think he told someone? Or was he going to use the fact that he lied about being quirkless as blackmail? His heartbeat was pounding in his ears and his head felt light and sickly. The teen's hands were cold and clammy under his gloves. He couldn't move, he couldn't breathe. The air in his lungs felt suffocating. It had only been a few seconds, but the echoes in his head made it seem like forever. Why wouldn't it stop? Was he still truly this reliant on All Might's opinion? Even after all this time, Thami was shaking him lightly, calling out his name, but he didn't register any of it. He just wanted someone to shut his head up. He just wanted it all to stop. The pain, the suffering, the misery. Why couldn't he just stop breathing already? He wanted relief. He wanted release. Was that too much to ask? There just isn't any other way. You're not going to be able to get anywhere when your records say quirkless. You'll just be spinning in circles until you've lost all the energy to keep going. "I can see your potential, and that's why I'm offering you my quirk." Hell, just the fact that it's my quirk should have you excited. You need to be realistic. 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 Yamada was not an idiot. He could see the obvious uncomfortableness all over Midoriya's face. There was definitely some sort of tension between the two, and All Might either didn't notice or didn't care. Letting the teen talk with the number one hero alone would not end well, especially not with him in this state. But what was taking him so long to respond? Oh, the teacher really wanted to slap himself. Maybe he was an idiot sometimes. He had just deduced that the boy felt obligated to just go with the flow. He was used to being submissive, not sticking up for himself and his well-being. Just because his reaction was plain to see didn't mean that his answer was that simple. The rest of his thoughts hit like a pile of bricks. There was no way Midoriya would deny the number one hero, even if that was what he truly wanted. He just didn't know any better. Present Mike had no idea what was the beef between the two parties, but he knew he needed to act fast and on instinct. About that. The words just came spilling out, but he just trusted in his subconscious at this point. "The little listener is here early to go over some English stuff with me, so I'm afraid we're both a bit tied up at the moment." All Might may be oblivious, but he certainly wasn't dumb. It didn't make sense for a teacher to be privately reviewing material this early into the school year. But it's barely the first week. But Yamada was a master of improv. Well, the little listener is quite the hard worker. Who would I be to deny him? The number one hero seemed to take that response as valid and shrugged. "All right then, I'll leave you to it. I'll catch young Midoriya some other time." With that, All Might walked away from the door, his footsteps slowly becoming more and more quiet. It wasn't until the tread grew completely silent that the blonde pro let out a sigh he didn't know he was holding. He turned towards the student behind him, who only looked up in shock. Midoriya couldn't understand, no matter how hard he racked his brain. Why did the teacher lie? There was no reason for him to. He had no idea of any of the hostility between himself and All Might. He drilled himself further, but could come up with no good reason why. It just didn't make sense. But his mind was still in utter turmoil, whirling around violently. He couldn't focus a single one of his many questions enough to phrase it verbally. But his mouth ached to say something to the man standing in front of him. He needed to know. Why? It was small, timid, and somber sounding. Yamato looked initially confused by the short question. But he shrugged slightly as if he was puzzled. Well, you didn't seem all that eager to go, so I figured you didn't want to. I could have told him myself. Even Midoriya knew that was a lie. The hero didn't want to belittle the teen by stating he couldn't have, even if it was true, so he stepped over that point carefully. I just figured I'd help out. Give you a good excuse so it wouldn't look all that bad in front of All Might. The boy moved to rebuttal, but that's when Gami stepped in. At least now you do not have to talk with that pathetic excuse for a hero. Just leave it at that. The teen internally flinched at his mentor's harsh words, but heeded his advice. Sure, he had a lot of questions, and not everything made sense, but Yamada had saved him from a potentially emotionally fatal encounter with the #1 hero. That warranted at least some thanks, which could arguably start with silence. But present Mike couldn't help his curiosity. I have no idea what happened between you and All Might, and I'm not asking to know. I just wanted to tell you that if you ever want to talk about it, I'll be there to listen. He totally wants to know about it. Gami couldn't help but intervene with a sarcastic comment. Midoriya rolled his eyes dramatically, but didn't deny the statement. Sometimes, he was really thankful no one could hear the ghost but himself. Yamada still hadn't heard a response from the boy in front of him, and took it as his cue to leave. Well, I'll get going. I'm sure I've got paperwork somewhere to catch up on. No, that outburst surprised everyone in the room, including the teen who exclaimed it. He grew red with embarrassment as his eyes turned downcast. He started fiddling with his gloves, which he determined a while back was his nervous tic. He noticed pieces by his fingertips felt threadbare. Did his scare with All Might really affect him that badly? He hadn't even noticed he had unconsciously triggered his powers. He really needed to get a handle on the mess that was himself. But now wasn't really the time to be focusing on that, as the English teacher remained frozen on his way to the door. Gathering up any confidence he could muster, Midoriya took his first step in repaying Yamada for his intervention. Too mean. You can stay. If you want, that is. Present Mike was genuinely surprised, but chose his question carefully, trying not to push any one answer. Are you sure? The teen blinked. Was he sure? He really had no idea, but something in his gut told him this was right. Not that he had to let the hero stay, but that he should. But was that what he wanted? Even the spirit next to him stared patiently, wondering what he'd give to a question like that. The answer was debatably more shocking than the outburst that started all this. Even Midoriya wasn't quite sure if it was really him talking. Yeah, I'm sure. Yamada stayed for as long as he possibly could. But he did eventually have to leave. The two did enjoy some idle chatter during their time together, with Midoriya being the mediator for whenever Gami wanted to contribute. But the English teacher did leave the classroom, giving the teen a few minutes alone to himself. He didn't really get to use his free time though, too busy setting himself up for class. Aizawa still hadn't returned from when he left originally, and the crowd seemed just as large as when he first observed. His classmates piled in gradually, each looking more disheveled than the last. Ada was the first one in the classroom, besides Midoriya of course. He stumbled in a bit ungracefully, but caught himself on the doorframe. Once he caught sight of the reserved boy huddled by his desk, his attention focused and he power walked over, straightening his raven blue hair on the way. Ada, he sighed a bit louder than usual since no one else was in the room. How are you? Midoriya, he cried out upon reaching the desk. I am well, though a bit frazzled. The number of reporters outside is completely obscene. That made the teen get out of his desk and walk towards the window. Goodness, they're really still out there. Ada looked puzzled. Whatever do you mean? Well, Aizawa-sensei went out there to try and calm the crowd. But I'm guessing it didn't exactly go as planned. Aizawa-sensei did help me get inside. But he is having difficulty controlling the catastrophe outside, he clarified. Midoriya hummed in confirmation and made his way back to his seat. The other boy, though, seemed to have something else on his mind. He moved his hand towards the green-haired teen, and he stopped and turned around at the gesture. The first 2 days of school, you came in at around average time, not too early, but certainly not late by any means, Ida expressed, moving his hands around violently. But these past few days you have been arriving here extremely early, even earlier than myself, which is saying something. I'm just wondering if there is a reason for the change in behavior. Startled, the boy looked over to his companion, who clearly wasn't expecting that observation either. Any normal person might have been freaked out by the level of attention a declaration like that required. but Midoriya was also a person who liked to observe people closely. If anyone could understand, it would be him. His notebooks were definitely proof of that. But still, he wasn't quite sure how comfortable he was revealing his new home situation. Telling Ida the truth, that he was currently living with Aizawa and that was the reason he was coming into school early, didn't seem like an option to him. Even though the raven-haired boy had been nothing but kind to him since they had met. Although a bit stiff, he just couldn't bring himself to spill the beans. I just decided to try and get to school earlier. He added in a bit of flattery in hopes it would get the strict student off his back. You kind of inspired me to be more responsible, you know. Ida practically beamed, his eyes sparkling through his glasses. I am so glad I could be a role model to such a successful student like yourself. Midoriya smiled and let out a small chuckle at the boy's antics, surprisingly not a hint of uncomfortableness in his laugh. Yeah, I got here a bit earlier than I should have this morning. Luckily, Aizawa-sensei let me in through the side entrance, so I didn't have to go through the mob out by the front. Well, that is quite convenient, Ida replied, pushing up his glasses. That does make me wonder how long it will take to disperse the crowd, if it gets dispersed at all, that is. I am a bit concerned that this could get out of hand. Gami jumped in suddenly. I am rightfully worried as well. Those reporters seem relentless. Well, they're probably after updates on All Might, the teen explained, relaying the info from Present Mike earlier. But I'm sure Aizawa-sensei and the other heroes will take care of it eventually. But even he did not believe his own words, underlying doubts simmering over the surface of his voice. The conversation died at that, with Ida making his way over to his desk to set himself up for the day. Eventually, followed more students, each one a complete mess of ruffled hair and panty breath. The deadly duo grew more concerned at each entry, Midoriya for Eraserhead's well-being, Gami for his successors. But Bakugo was not among the students arriving for class, and the boy couldn't help but feed his curiosity. Uraraka rushed inside the classroom as one of the later students. The teen and his mentor both watched her struggle to her desk and throw her bag down into the seat. Her hair was disheveled and her face flushed red. She frantically waved her hand in front of her face, desperately attempting to cool herself off. Midoriya wanted to get out of his seat and ask her about how she was doing, but the churning in his stomach kept him grounded. Luckily for him, the brunette made her way over to him instead. Midori, she cried, have you seen the number of people outside? It's insane. So I've heard, he quipped back. Are you all right? She laughed and combed her hair messily with her fingers. Yeah, just a bit exhausted. Aizawa-sensei helped me get past them though. He hummed. Yeah, I heard the same from Ida actually. How's he doing? He's been out there a while. Uraraka shrugged. Aizawa-sensei looked more tired than anything really. I wouldn't worry too much. That eased some of the odd churning in the boy's gut, but he still looked towards the window in hopes he could spot his teacher's figure. The ghost too floated over to sneak a glance, but his downcast head was more than enough for Midoriya to know he hadn't spotted anyone. Worry about what? With a familiar sense of déjà vu, both students turned to the now open door to see their homeroom teacher standing there, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The tired man walked inside casually, drawing silence from all corners of the classroom. But the shock of seeing the pro quickly faded when someone else moved from behind him. This was the first time Bakugo had been in class since the training exercise incident. But his angry scowl still remained. The timid boy flinched instinctively and shied away his eyes towards the window. Uraraka, like much of the class, simply stared at the return of their volatile classmate. Aizawa didn't bother to pry out a response for his previous question. He also wasn't blind to the stares coming at the student behind him. This was to be expected. This was what he expected. But he didn't comment and moved tiredly towards his desk instead. But when he watched Bakugo move towards his desk as well, right in front of Midoriya, he remembered the other thing he was supposed to do when he got back to the classroom. Midoriya, he called out monotonously, opting to use the boy's name rather than the nickname he had given him. I've got a new seat for you. Originally, the hero wanted to move Bakugo elsewhere and keep Midoriya right where he was. He didn't want the student to feel seemingly punished by having to change seats. But when he attempted to plan out the move last night, he realized that anywhere he moved the blonde wouldn't really work out. Most of the new spots were either still too close to the green-haired teen or were too close to Ida or Uraraka. He had talked to those other two students a day after the incident, and while neither seemed too traumatized by the event, Aizawa still didn't feel comfortable moving Bakugo near either of them. There were a few promising spots that the hero considered, but when he explored them more in depth, they were shot out of the sky quickly. He could switch Bakugo and Aoyama. That would keep the blonde far enough away from both parties, as well as in the front where he could see him. But there was a reason Aoyama was in the front of the classroom. The flamboyant boy was too dramatic to be moved even a row back. That was just a headache waiting to happen. The only other spot he could think of was switching Bakugo and Yaoyorozu, which again would keep him away from both parties. But putting the angry teen in the back of the classroom would no doubt turn out to be a disaster. Plus Aizawa was observant, and he did notice the glares Bakugo would send to Todoroki. The blonde seemed to have unnatural hostility towards the candy cane teen as well. Not as much as towards Midoriya, but still enough to not want to put the two boys next to each other. So the pro came to the conclusion to move Midoriya instead. But now the question was where. There weren't many options for that either. He didn't want to put the boy near Uraraka or Ada, as he was concerned they'd just use the opportunity to talk or get distracted. Again, he could switch Midoriya and Aoyama, but that brought up the same problems as before. There was only one switch he could see working out. Yes, sensei. The boy called out hesitantly. Switch with Yaoyorozu. This made the most rational sense in his eyes. Now, Bakugo would be a good distance from both parties and still near the front of the class where Aizawa could keep an eye on him. Midoriya, Uraraka, and Ada were all decently separated so they wouldn't distract each other. Plus, Yaoyorozu was a no-nonsense type of student. If anyone could tolerate sitting behind the explosive blonde, it would be her. The move was quick. Yaoyorozu didn't seem too bothered by it either, which was good. Both students packed up their things and swapped with haste, and Midoriya plopped himself down in the very back corner of the classroom. Todoroki, who was seated directly adjacent to Yaoyorozu's old spot, gave a stoic but friendly head nod. The boy smiled back softly. Hoping not to draw Aizawa's attention, he noticed Gami making gestures in his peripheral, but bottled up his sarcastic comments for later. The class didn't get too distracted by the sudden move, and all the students piped down as their teacher placed his hands on his desk. All the attention was directed back to the front of the room, including Midoriya and Todoroki, whose heads snapped straight from looking at each other. Aizawa slapped a stack of papers hard onto the wood, startling anyone else whose attention may have been slipping. Good work with the battle training a few days ago. The pro started, shaking around the papers in his hand. I've looked over your grades and evaluations. Whispers started up at that, but the teacher quickly shushed them with a smack of the papers against the grain of his desk. Bakugo, he began, debating his next words wisely. He didn't want to beat a dead horse, especially since he and Nezu had already ridiculed him throughout the days before. But he also wanted to make it clear that the incident would not be swept under the rug. Grow up already. Stop being petty and wasting your talent. All eyes turned to the blonde, who merely growled under his breath. Got it. And Midoriya. He flinched at the announcement of his name, the eyes moving to him instead. Gami copied Bakugo's reaction and growled, though protectively instead of cynically. The ghost stepped closer towards his successor's desk, putting his hulking form between the boy and the hero. And though no one could really feel intimidated, the teen did feel more comfortable knowing someone had his back. Learn to be more self-preserving. You can't save anyone if you incapacitate yourself first. The pro knew that was a bit harsh, but he was shaping future heroes here. After watching the replay of the training exercise with Midoriya, he saw scary similarities with that student and All Might, both reckless individuals who liked to put others before themselves. Normally comparing someone to All Might would be nothing but a compliment, but Aizawa despised how the number one hero behaved. There are very few abilities that could allow one to keep up with a powerhouse like that. And though immortality was one, he did not want any of his students tearing themselves apart in the name of heroism. And being Midoriya's homeroom teacher, as well as his temporary caretaker, he would do his best to squash the problem at its source. Yai's Aizawa-sensei. He replied submissively. You have to admit, he is not wrong. Gami didn't want to rub salt into the wound, but did want to reinforce the valid point the man was making. He cared enough about his successor to not want to see him in pieces every battle. Now, on to homeroom business, Aizawa stated, moving on from the topic before. This might seem a bit sudden, but today, the boy could practically see the wave of nervousness wash over the class, but couldn't deny that the same wave washed over him. What would they be doing today? Another quirk test, more practical training, risk of expulsion. The anticipation was eating away at his consciousness. You'll pick a class president. And then the class absolutely exploded. Cries from all around the room could be heard, each one proclaiming why they were the best fit for president. The complete outburst of chaos was so startling. Midoriya nearly fell backwards in his chair. I want to be president. Let me do it. The position was made for me. I'd like to do it. I want to be a leader. In my administration, girls will have to show 30 centimeters of thigh. Goodness, is this class president role truly that important? Gami wondered aloud. Well, normally, the position entails just routine tasks, so nobody really wants to do it, Midoriya explained at a decent volume, the rest of his class easily drowning him out. But being class president here at UA would really be a position for a top hero in the making. I see, the ghost clarified, but does that still typically require this much of an outburst? The teen simply shrugged, opting instead to sink himself down into his seat. As amazing of an opportunity to be class president at UA was, it definitely wasn't something he could see himself doing. It was just too far into the spotlight for his confidence. He was fine with anyone else taking the position, really. The only exception would be Bakugo, but even then, he could probably tolerate it with enough time. Quiet down, everyone. That voice was certainly not Aizawa's. So everyone promptly shut up and looked around for its source. Eventually, all eyes fell on one familiar glasses-wearing boy seated near the back. Leading the many is a task of heavy responsibility. Ada started, pushing up his glasses dramatically, but ambition does not equate to ability. He then stood up, startling the students around him. He placed his hands down roughly onto the surface of his desk, creating a dramatic bang. This sacred office demands the trust of its constituents. If this is to be a democracy, then I ought to put forward the notion. The deathly duo eagerly awaited for the end of Ida's declaration, along with the rest of the class. Surprisingly, despite his outward appearance, Aizawa too was listening in. He, unlike the others, had a fair idea where the student was going, but was more interested in how the rest of the class would receive the idea that our true leader must be chosen by election. Gami cocked his head curiously. An election, is that how the position of class president is normally chosen? Now that the chaos was practically over, Midoriya couldn't speak without being noticed, so he shook his hand side to side under his desk, indicating to his mentor that his statement was correct some of the times. The spirit nodded his head, but still continued to stare at the class of students in pure fascination. It hadn't even occurred to the boy that Gami may never have seen a class president election. There were many things he often forgot Gami didn't know about. The two watched as Sui turned around from her desk to face Ada. But Ada, we haven't known each other long enough to build trust. Everyone will just vote for themselves. Kirishima jumped in, but the stiff boy didn't seem fazed. That is precisely why anyone who manages to earn multiple votes will be the best suited individual to the job. That seemed to satisfy the majority of the students. So Ida turned to face Aizawa, who was currently stuffing himself into one of his sleeping bags. Will you allow this, sensei? The teacher merely shrugged. I don't care, just make it quick. And that was enough confirmation for the class to somehow gather up a box and enough slips of paper to start their vote. Ada directed it organizedly, having the students go up and submit their vote in an orderly fashion. Because of his move to the back, Midoriya was close to being last to vote and had plenty of time to think about it. Todoroki went up before him, and both Midoriya and Gami watched him walk. He noticed the boy seemed a bit hesitant, but that was most likely because he'd never voted for a class president before. The teen drew a lot of similarities between Todoroki and his mentor, and often associated Gami's experiences with what could potentially be his. So he assumed by his behavior that he had never voted for a class president before. But whether that was true or not needed a direct statement to be sure. Eventually, it was his turn to get up and vote for a class president. His mentor followed close behind, interested to see how the process worked. Who are you planning on nominating? He asked, hoping for another following explanation to why. But Midoriya simply shot him a sly smirk, before waving off one of his fingers subtly in a dismissive tone. Gami still caught the action and huffed sarcastically, before heading back to the boy's desk alone. If his friend wanted privacy, then he would grant it, no matter his curiosity. Eventually, all the kids had placed their votes. Ida took natural charge, walking up to grab the box and giving it a good shake. He then took off the lid and started taking out the individual slips of paper, marking the votes on the board behind him. The class waited in tense silence as the numbers were tallied up, and once Ida wrote the last tick mark on the board, everyone erupted. How did I get 2 votes? Midoriya exclaimed in nothing but disbelief. Gami shrugged nonchalantly, still not really understanding exactly how the process worked. Todoroki cocked his head in confusion next to him, but didn't say a word. Who the hell voted for Deku? Bakugo cried out in shock. He only got 1 vote, which he placed himself. Angrily, he stood up and clenched his fingers, steam practically leaving his ears. Guess we know it wasn't you. One black-haired student with bulky elbows quipped back. While his successor was internally freaking out, the ghost took a look around the classroom, observing the rest of the reaction. Yaoyorozu was straightening out her clothes and making her way over to the front of the classroom. She, like Midoriya, received 2 votes, tying him for first place. Gami wondered how the position of class president was going to be decided now. Ada was sulking at his desk, having only received 1 vote, which was unfortunately not enough to place. The other students were giving the strict boy weird looks, but otherwise said nothing. Though Gami was more interested in whether Ada voted for himself or someone voted for him instead. Uraraka was whistling inconspicuously near the back of the classroom, her glance away from the currently yelling Bakugo. And while the spirit wasn't accustomed to most modern societal practices, such as the concept of a class president, he could easily tell she had voted for Midoriya. It made him feel strangely honored that the brunette thought his successor was fit for the position. Well, Aizawa called over the crowd, silencing everyone. Both Midoriya and Yaoyorozu tied for first place. How are you going to decide the class president now? The hero almost looked annoyed that the process was taking so long, but even still, he gestured for the green-haired boy to come up from and join Yaoyorozu. Gami decided now was a good time to return back to the teen's side, to at least show his support as he walked up to the front. The Spectre wished he could do more to ease his successor's shaking though, as his nervousness was starting to spill over. Once Midoriya stood next to the spiky, black-haired girl, he tried to solve both the current dilemma and his own. "It's no big deal, Yaoyorozu can just be Midoriya." She interrupted him stiffly. "Did you vote for yourself?" No. But he tried to get his point across, but the student wouldn't let him. "Well, I did," she revealed. "So you truly earned the spot of class president." "But, fine." Aizawa figured enough time had been wasted. "So your president is Midoriya and your vice president is Yaoyorozu. I look forward to working with you, Midoriya." Yaoyorozu nodded professionally. "Same too. TTOU," he replied back not as smoothly. Aizawa sighed and let the two sit down, before attempting to get class started. But that didn't mean he missed the way Midoriya dragged his feet back. After fostering the boy for a few days, he came to understand his submissive and shy behavior. So when he was selected to be the class president, especially after not voting for himself, the pro had mixed feelings. This was obviously not what the child wanted, but this was also a good opportunity for him to gain more confidence, which was essential for hero work. There was also the risk that the pressures of such a position could send any progress he made with the student spiraling. He sighed again, heavier this time. It was going to be a long day. Lunch rolled around much quicker than Midoriya expected, but to be fair, he couldn't really focus on the passing time due to his anxiety. The entire day, his hands shook uncontrollably and his skin was slick with sweat. He knew his mentor had picked up on his stress early, but couldn't find the time to properly address it during one of his classes. Both were eager for lunch for related, yet different reasons. He hadn't planned on eating today, but his stress was starting to make him lightheaded, so he succumbed to his urges and bought a small bowl of rice. Gami wished his successor ate more each day, but the boy was used to fending for himself. His lunch funds still came from his own pocket and neither Aizawa nor Yamada had checked it out yet. The ghost could only hope that one of the two teachers got around to checking his lunch account and figured out he was still paying it himself. Then, just maybe, his friend would finally be able to eat substantially every day. He sat down at his table alone, not waiting to start at his rice. It was only a matter of time before Uraraka and Ida joined him as they did every day. Gami was taking his time to weave between the crowded cafeteria, which had always seemed unusual considering the ghost could just pass through them. He made it to the table eventually and floated over to talk to his successor. "Feeling any better?" the man asked with concern. "A little," he responded, shakily serving himself another portion of rice. "Hey Midori," Uraraka called out, placing her tray down onto the table. "It's finally lunch time, am I right?" Hey Uraraka," he responded startled. Had she heard him talking to Gami? By her statement, he assumed not, but still, he had to make sure. "Did you, Midoriya?" Ada then unknowingly interrupted. "Congratulations on your position as class president." Thanks Ada. He watched the blue-haired boy drop his tray on the table as well, before sitting himself down. "I'm just worried about whether or not I can really be class president." Ada shoved a mouthful of rice into his mouth. "Midoriya, your grit and decisiveness in a pinch make you perfectly suited to lead us all. That's why I voted for you." What? That made the teen do a double take. "You voted for me?" "Indeed. One of your 2 votes was from myself." "Yeah, you totally got this, Midori." Uraraka jumped in on the pep talk. "Your plan during the training exercise was amazing and you predicted Bakugo to the smallest detail. I couldn't think of anyone better to vote for than you." "You both really voted for me?" he asked rhetorically in surprise. Both kids nodded, still eating. Ada, though, let his curiosity get the best of him. "You admitted earlier that you did not vote for yourself. Who did you choose then, if you don't mind me asking?" "I am interested to know as well." Midoriya rolled his eyes sarcastically at his mentor, but turned to his friends with a more genuine look. "I actually voted for you, Ida," said boy looked flabbergasted. Yeah, he confirmed. "You're so responsible and such a great role model. You even organized the entire vote. I thought you of all people definitely deserved the spot." "That's true," Uraraka agreed. "Didn't you want to be president, Ada? You've got the glasses and everything." Both Gami and his successor winced at the brunette's bluntness, but Ada didn't seem to mind. "Again, ambition and suitability are different matters," he explained. "I humbly made the choice I felt was correct." The more Ada talked, the more he reminded Midoriya of his mentor. His professional tone of voice and his respectful mannerisms made him question the specifics of Ada's home life. He wondered how the teen would react if he even met his ghostly companion. He would probably enjoy a conversation with him at the very least. "The way you talk." Uraraka seemed to be catching on. "Ada, are you a rich kid?" Again, the duo flinched at the statement. Ida too seemed a bit appalled by it, but distracted himself by shoving more rice into his mouth. "I don't like people to know, so I try to hide it," he started. "But yes, I'm from a renowned hero family, and I am the second son." Both of the other students sparkled at the admission, growing more excited by the minute. Do you know of the turbo hero, Ingenium? That flipped a switch in Midoriya's head, of course. He employs 65 sidekicks at his office in Tokyo. So you're… Yes, he interrupted. He is my brother. He leads the people with his unwavering adherence to rules and regulations. He's truly a beloved hero. The boy stood up proudly, pushing his glasses up from his nose. He could feel the pride swell in his heart, making him want to show off his family heritage to the world, or at least to the two kids in front of him. It's my admiration for my brother that has inspired my own desire to become a hero, though I realize I am not yet ready to lead anyone. He sat back down, sending a small smile in his friend's direction. As the superior candidate, it was right that the role should go to you, Midoriya. Both kids gaped in shock for a few moments. That last bit made the quiet teen feel especially bad about not wanting the role. Ada was just so enthusiastic about it, and he himself felt wrong for not feeling the same way. Uraraka was the first to break the temporary silence. I've never seen you smile before, Ada, she commented. Hey, he cried back, is that so? I smile on occasion. And just like that, the worries from before melted away. Seeing his two friends laugh so heartily made his soul feel warm, like he was standing next to a fireplace. I am truly glad they are your friends, Gami whispered suddenly as he watched the entire conversation play out. I only wish you had met them sooner. Me too, he answered under his breath, and the two chatted together, but I'm just glad to know them now. All three, as well as the entirety of the cafeteria, jumped out of their skins at the sudden blaring of the school alarm system. Both Midoriya and Ada leapt out of their seats as Uraraka choked on her rice. Students started rushing to exit the cafeteria, pushing and shoving their way to get to the front. Desperate for direction, the group of friends plus one ghost listened for an announcement. Security level 3 has been broken. All students please evacuate in an orderly fashion. But that only raised more questions for the trio. Another student passed their table, so Ada called out to him, what's security level 3? It means someone has infiltrated the building. He replied panicky. Hasn't happened in my 3 years. Anyway, hurry up and get out of here. At that, both Uraraka and Ada rushed to follow the crowd, but something made Midoriya quickly pull them back by the ends of their uniforms, something he would have never done in the past. Wait, if we just rush in, we'll be completely trampled. The two recovered from their momentary panic. Ada replied first. Then what should we do? The teen knew he didn't have much time to form a plan, so he looked around. The cafeteria was now completely empty, except for the crowd of kids piled by the exits. The walls around them were covered in huge windows that led directly outside. The windows, he realized. Maybe we can figure out what's going on or who got inside. Let's split up then, Ada added. We can cover more of them. The three nodded and ran towards the windows to look. Midoriya took a second longer though, and addressed the ghost standing next to him. I assume you want me to search as well. The boy nodded. Start by checking the perimeter of the school. If you find how they got inside, come right back. All right, I shall search urgently, but thoroughly, he reassured, but left immediately through one of the windows. Once the spirit disappeared, he ran over to a group of windows facing what he presumed was the back of the school. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so he moved over to check the next set. His head darted around feverishly, searching for anything strange, like a suspicious person or a potential infiltration. But nothing stood out, and he was growing more concerned by the second. Over here, Ada's voice rang out over the panic from the hallways around them. It's just the media. Uraraka and Midoriya ran over quickly and looked in the direction he was pointing. Sure enough, it was just a large crowd of reporters from this morning, now somehow inside and trying to storm the school. We need to tell everyone, Uraraka cried out. They're all panicking over nothing. But how? Ada looked towards the crowd, who were still fighting to escape. The chaos will prevent any attention we try to grab. Midoriya's gaze shot over to the crowd as well. Eyes darted every which way. What should he do? They needed to stop the panic before someone was seriously injured, but his mind was coming up completely blank. This was his first action as class president. He couldn't let Ada and Uraraka down so soon. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Gami floating back to him, coming from one of the packed hallways. He watched the ghost fly over the crowd to get to him. But right at that moment, the spirit reached his successor, secretly out of breath, but would never let it show after the time the boy teased him. He hoped he hadn't taken that long inspecting the cause of the break-in, but he had discovered some riveting information he knew the teen would want to hear about. It is just the press, the man explained exasperatedly. They somehow broke through the front gate. The teen nodded subtly, trying not to draw attention to his weird movement in the already tense situation. His mind wandered back to seeing Gami fly over the crowd with ease, and that sparked an idea in the back of his head. Guys, he said confidently, I have a plan. Together, the three students made their way to the start of the chaotic crowd, arms linked to prevent their separation. Once at the start of the hallway and beginning to get sucked into the mass, Ada called out, Now Uraraka. He cried, Make me float. On it, she exclaimed, and slapped hands with him. Almost immediately, Ida began to lift off the ground. Midoriya and Uraraka then grabbed onto the bottom of his shoes and began guiding him above the ground, like a giant parade balloon. And in time one of the two started to become separated. Ida would pull his legs together and draw his friend back towards him. Remember, we need to draw their attention. The normally quiet teen yelled to his friends. There, the exit sign. Ida shouted as it came into sight. Should we let go now? The brunette shrieked, barely clutching onto the tips of his shoe. No, he called back. Not yet. I need to be closer. As the three approached the exit sign, Midoriya could feel his grip on Ida slipping. He could barely hold on anymore. Gami, who was floating above him, tried pulling his successor closer, but wasn't able to get a hold of him. Ida, the boy cried out, I can't hold on much longer. Now then, let me go. The two did as they were told, and released Ida from their grasp. He allowed himself to float momentarily to roll up his uniform pants. Then, after pushing himself away from the wall, he activated his quirk. Engine boost. Like a sonic jet, Ida whirled around on the air, a lot more uncontrollably than either he or Midoriya had anticipated. He twirled around like a spinning coin, so fast he couldn't tell which way was forward. His eyes flew around disorientedly, trying to pick apart his surroundings. What's Ida doing? Uraraka yelled to Midoriya, who she was reaching out for. I don't think he can see which way to go. He screamed back, I think he's too dizzy. They linked arms after a few moments of struggling, now together, but still being mauled by the crowd. They both stretched for one of Ida's legs, but neither could reach. Gami too tried to push the boy, but his arms simply phased right through. Now, Midoriya was faced with a tough decision. He could summon his scythe to push Ida with, but that could turn dangerous in this volatile of a crowd. Plus his DT could act up and potentially hurt his friends. But if he did nothing, he along with Uraraka and countless others would be crushed. Two options currently were weighing in his head. Prioritizing his fears or prioritizing the safety of the students. Well, when his mind put it that way, the choice was clear. Uraraka, I need my hands, he ordered her, and she quickly let go, only to grab the back of his shirt. He thrusted both hands as high above the crowd as he could. Then summoning his weapon with a quick flex, in a hasty but gentle motion, he snapped his blade to its flat side and bopped Ida with it, sending him in the direction of the exit sign. Once he saw the boy start to move, he allowed his shoulders drop and let his side disappear. Ida tumbled around in the air before face planting into the wall, recovering quickly. He grabbed the pipe overhead for stability. He needed to say something to catch everyone's attention, something short and concise, straight to the point. Everything's fine. The entire crowd of anxious kids stopped. The teen took that as a cue to keep going. It's just the press, he continued. There's nothing to panic about. We're fine. Feeling a bit of his older brother channeling within him, he added on to that, this is UA. Behave in a way befitting this great institution. And just like that, students started to look around. The ones closest to the windows peered out and confirmed Ida's statement. Once the panic died down, kids began making their way back to their classrooms, no longer fighting to escape the enclosed hallway. The space eventually emptied out, with only Midoriya, Uraraka, and a few other students remaining. Both kids rushed over to the entryway with the exit sign above it. Ida, the brunette cried, that was amazing. You did it. Midoriya jumped in. There's no more panic. Ida didn't bother moving from his spot on the wall, still gripping the pipe for dear life. I don't deserve all the credit. Without either of you two, there was no way I could have pulled this off. He turned to Uraraka, fixing his glasses with his free hand. Your quirk was essential to this plan. Without being able to float above the crowd, I would have not been able to gather everyone's attention. I would have been trampled instead. The girl flushed, not used to her non-offensive quirk being praised in such a way. She rubbed a hand at the back of her head sheepishly. Aw, thanks. And you, Midoriya, he continued. Your decisiveness and response time were incredible in the midst of the panic. And your plan to calm the crowd was remarkable, as well as your flexibility in the face of hindrance. You are truly the best choice for class president. The teen sighed. Back to that topic again. He really had no idea what he was going to do regarding his role. Would it be best to just suck it up and deal with it? Or should he come clean to Ida and Uraraka in hopes they had another solution? He really didn't think he was fit to be president. And that wasn't even considering the fact he didn't want to be. You shouldn't sell yourself short, Ida, the green-haired boy began. After all, it was you who calmed everyone down. You sounded like a true leader up there. That wasn't just formality talking either. Ida really did sound like a professional, calming the crowd in a matter of seconds. That was a trait Midoriya was certain he didn't possess, one perfect for a role model. If only more people had seen the strict boy's potential in leading others, then Ida would most definitely be the best candidate for class president. That brought an idea to the forefront of his head. But he quickly pushed it aside when a UA staff member came along carrying a stepladder. Someone else must have alerted the staff that a student was stuck above an entryway, since neither Midoriya nor Uraraka had left to get anyone. Thankfully, the rescue response was quick and Ida was helped down by his two friends. The duo watched his shoulders relaxed as his feet touched the solid ground, though the stiff boy never addressed it. After a few moments of catching breath, the three made their way back to their classroom, hoping they weren't late enough to spark Aizawa's wrath. Together, they held their breath as Ida pried open the giant door. It unfortunately made a loud groaning sound, and the three students winced in conjunction. Once the door was completely opened, the three braced themselves for whatever was to come. The trio were met with the enamored stares of the majority of their classmates. Kids started to get out of their chairs to make comments, but Aizawa quickly put a stop to that. Midoriya, the class has been waiting on you to start some presidential matters. The blatant call-out made the boy want to sink into the ground. Everyone else sit down and stay quiet. The students that stood out of their seat quickly sat back down after that, and Uraraka and Ida scurried over to their own. Midoriya hurried to the front of the call where Yaoyorozu was waiting, and she debriefed him on the situation, nodding solemnly. He turned towards the rest of the seated class, but hesitated to address them. Go ahead, class president. The teen couldn't tell if Yaoyorozu was trying to encourage him or just being sarcastic. Just take a deep breath. You can do this, Gami whispered, which startled his successor since the ghost hadn't said anything in a while. Doing as his mentor told, he took a moment to regain his composure before speaking. We'd like to choose the other student council members, but before that, he looked directly at Ida, before taking a second to organize his thoughts. To the others around him, it seemed like he was making a dramatic pause. I believe, he started shakily, that Ida is better suited to be class president. He watched said boy gasp in surprise, along with a good majority of the class, but he didn't let that kill his confidence. You all saw how well he led everyone in that crisis earlier, the boy explained. I think he's the correct choice for the job. Ida stood up in shock and tried to refute, but his classmates were faster. Sounds good. Ida really showed his stuff back in the cafeteria. Kirishima agreed. Not that I've anything against you, Midori. Another student with blonde hair and a black zigzag streak jumped in. He was like a beacon pointing to the emergency exit. The rest of the class joined the Ida praising bandwagon, and the strict boy felt a flush of pride flow through his bones, though he turned to Aizawa as a last-ditch effort to get Midori to keep his position. Aizawa-sensei, will you allow this? He asked with a hint of desperation underlying in his voice. But the teacher didn't care, since there was no way a pro like Eraserhead could miss a detail like that. He just continued to drink out of his juice pouch, why giving the class an eerie glare. Whatever, just get on with it. Well, with the teacher, semi-approval, Ida couldn't really refuse. As great as he believed Midoriya was suited for the role, he had passed it on to him. And an opportunity like that was one that should be accepted with open arms. Not only for his own benefit, but to respect his friend. Very well, Ida agreed. I will accept the job then, but only if Midoriya remains on the council as secretary. Your brilliance is too great to lose. That in turn made the teen shy away in embarrassment, but luckily Gami was there to pick him up. That seems like a fair offer to me, as well as a genuine compliment. Class president was something he could never do himself, but a student council member, maybe that was something he could. Besides, it was a great offer, something that made him feel prideful, an emotion he didn't experience often. I can do that, Midoriya confirmed, to which Ida smiled. Yaoyorozu, who had been observing the situation quietly at the front of the classroom, smiled softly as well. Surprisingly, she was glad to have both students as part of the class government, despite however she may have originally felt about the timid teen being class president. The other students followed suit at the feeling of celebration. You can do it, emergency exit Ida. Go emergency exit Ida. Do your best. The stiff boy chuckled and walked up to join Yaoyorozu in the front. Together, the two put up a strong, professional front for Class 1A. Ida latched his arms behind his back and puffed out his chest slightly, resembling a regal lion. Well, let's get down to business, he stated, calling the rest of the class to attention. Now that Midoriya is our secretary, we'll need 2 more students to step up for treasurer and historian. And at that, the class devolved into shouts and chaos, all trying to justify why they would be best for the position. Midoriya, now back in his seat, smiled at the antics around him. Gami approached his desk, wanting to say something about what he discovered earlier, but decided against it. He wanted to let his successor enjoy the peace while it lasted. It wasn't long before the day ended and the students started leaving the classroom. All of the class roles had been filled, and Ida made one last announcement as president before letting everyone go. Like usual, he and Uraraka waited for Midoriya to pack up his things at his desk, as the boy took unreasonably long to put his items away. So, are we walking to the station together? The brunette asked curiously. At that, Midoriya sighed and shook his head. Sorry, but I have to stay back again. That was the 3rd time he had used that excuse. It wasn't that he didn't want to walk with the duo, but ever since being put under Aizawa's care, he didn't need to go to the station anymore. The boy didn't want to tell them the truth though, opting to keep it for himself. If he did, then they would start asking questions and prying into him, which was the exact opposite of what he wanted. Though, if he was going to keep this up, he would have to come up with better excuses. You've been doing that each day since school started, Ida pointed out. Is something wrong? If you do not wish to walk with us, that is fine as well. No, the teen immediately denied. It's not you guys. I really don't want to get into it, but just know that this isn't really my choice. I don't think I'll ever be able to walk with you guys to the station. That's all right, Midori, Uraraka reassured, trying to lift the mood. We'll see you tomorrow then. Midoriya wanted to call after them, but the two left too quickly to hear. He reached out his hand in hopes to grab one of them by their uniform top, but his glove only gripped air. His shoulders fell solemnly, too sad to notice that he was the only one left in the classroom. They will understand when the time arrives, Gami consoled gently. I don't know if that time will ever come. He speculated back. Neither decided to keep the conversation going. But after only a few moments of silence, the ghost figured it was time to change the mood. Would now be an opportune time to hear of all the discoveries I made earlier. Oh, he wondered, there's more. Indeed, the man explained. I did not have time to divulge everything I witnessed outside. His successor made a gesture to keep going. Do tell then. The barrier to close off the front entrance of the school was destroyed completely. 4 layers in all, he spilled, although it does not look to be the work of an explosive. Whoa, that is concerning, he mumbled. I know reporters can get desperate, but it doesn't make sense for one to pull something risky like that. Yue could sue them for property damage at the very least. I do not understand, Gami inquired. Are you implying that it was not a reporter who destroyed the barrier? That's exactly what I'm implying. Midoriya clarified, growing increasingly worried. Did you notice anything else? Unfortunately not, he replied, going back to a point he feared his successor missed. Do you think the destruction of the barrier was the work of a quirk? If it's not from an explosive, the teen continued, then probably. He twiddled his fingers nervously, ignoring that fact that Aizawa was staring at him concerningly from his desk. This sounded bad, really bad. He was positive that a reporter would not have done the damage, but that only left one other plausible option. It was some sort of villain that broke into the school, using the mass of reporters as cover. But that brought up its own set of terrifying issues to think about. Why? What was the reason? Did they intend to retrieve something from the building? Or was this just a statement? The more he thought about it, the more it unnerved him. The only way to ease his racing mind was to see it for himself and draw his own conclusion. Then, the classroom door opened suddenly, startling both Aizawa and Midoriya, who were sitting in silence the entire time. In popped Nezu, whose tail was swaying almost anxiously. He turned right to the pro, barely acknowledging the student at all. Aizawa-san, the principal addressed, we need you out by the front. The other teachers are already waiting. The hero nodded, standing up out of his chair to leave the classroom. It was obvious that the two along with the rest of the staff were going to inspect the front entrance. But when the boy realized he was going to be left behind, he stood up suddenly, his desk chair screeching violently against the floor. Wait, he cried, can I come inspect the damage too? That comment made both heroes come to an ironically screeching halt. How did you know about the damage? Aizawa's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Nezu said nothing about that. Realizing what his teacher was implying, he backtracked hard, and no, Gami told me about it just now. I had him investigate during the panic earlier. When neither Aizawa nor Nezu replied, he continued rambling. He said the barrier was destroyed and I wanted to see for myself. I'm just concerned it's not from a reporter and I just wanted to make sure for myself and all. I won't bother you guys if you let me go. Figuring he should probably stop talking, he shut his mouth abruptly, opting to look at the ground rather than at any disapproving glares. He should have not said anything at all, considering he could probably have found a way to check out the entrance for himself. But no, he just had to go and ask for permission. Absolutely not, Aizawa answered. Sure, Nezu finished. The conflict in statements brought Midoriya's gaze up from the floor, just to see the two teachers staring at one another like they had each grown an extra head. Eraserhead was the first to speak though, beating out the rat by a few seconds. I am not allowing Midoriya to be a part of this investigation. He stated strongly, despite whatever you may believe, he is still a student at this school, as well as a minor. Nonsense. Aizawa-san, Nezu responded as if what the pro said previously held no worth. An extra pair of eyes never hurt anybody. Nezu, the teacher seemed to be reaching his limit. May I continue to remind you that he is a student. The last thing we want to do is instill any more underlying fear after what happened earlier. Ah, but he already knows. There's no point in denying his curiosity if the secret has been spilled. Aizawa sighed. You're not going to take no for an answer, are you? Nope. The principal popped the pea a bit too cheerfully. Another loud sigh could be heard. Fine then, let's go, problem child. We're already late enough as is. There was a sudden, hushed yes from the corner of the classroom. But other than that, complete silence. The three exited the classroom together, with the two staff members in the front and Midoriya tagging behind. Well, Gami was there too, but it was easy for the teachers to forget about him periodically. Though, today was not one of those times. So Midoriya. Nezu was certainly an unpredictable individual, and he often startled the deathly duo, whether it was through his actions or his words. Did Gami say anything more about the barrier? After all, he was the only one to see it in the moment. We didn't get to see it until after the reporters were cleared out. Well, he said that all 4 layers of the barrier were completely destroyed. The teen's analytic mind kicked into gear. The process must have been considerably fast since it was all destroyed by the time Gami got there, which was much earlier than any of the staff, going by your statement of course. How did Gami know there were 4 layers to that barrier? Aizawa questioned cynically. The ghost looked confused. I counted. Midoriya was puzzled too, but more by the hero's relentlessness. He says he counted. That made the pro huffed in annoyance, but he otherwise stayed quiet, allowing the boy to continue. Gami did say that he didn't think the damage was caused by an explosion, he added. Nezu hummed, interesting. It didn't take much longer to reach the front exit of the school, and the 3 walked out as if they were going home. But instead, they stopped at the front entrance, where the rest of the main hero teachers were waiting. Midoriya could name them all by heart, which left him in an undisturbed state of awe. Midnight, 13, Recovery Girl, Cementos, Ectoplasm, Present Mike, Vlad King, Snipe, Power Loader. But the student was ultimately disturbed by one of the teachers. Nezu, Cementos stated roughly, why is there a student behind you? I invited Midoriya to join us, Ishiyama-san, he explained, so no worries. The other teachers seemed a bit uncomfortable at the principal's eagerness, but didn't bother to say anything in return. Anyway, Nezu continued, I'm sure it is pretty obvious that no ordinary reporter could have done this. That comment turned the mood sour, and all of the adults, plus the one teen, turned to inspect the dismantled entryway. The boy peeked out from behind Aizawa to take a look as well. The majestic front entrance Midoriya remembered so fondly from the entrance exam was practically completely destroyed. The 4 layers were visible, as well as piles of debris surrounding. The air smelled faintly of rusted metal, the same aroma one would expect old blood to radiate. The rodent was the first to move forward towards the rubble, clasping his paws behind his back. It's obvious someone instigated this whole affair. The question is, did some evildoer manage to slip in, or do they intend to wage some greater war? Curious, the teen took another slow step in the direction of the entrance. The other teachers gasped in surprise, but no one made a move to stop him. Gami recognized the glint in his successor's eyes. What is it, Izu? What have you noticed? Nezu, too, seemed to pick up on the fact that the student's mind was working into overdrive. He turned back around and smiled. As sir, he asked shakily, and may I? Nezu, Snipe cried, you can't be serious. Go right ahead, Midoriya. The principal answered, ignoring Snipe's cry. So the teen did. Walking right up to the destroyed barrier, he was careful not to put his hands on the torn metal. Inspecting the edge of the barrier, he quickly squatted down to feel the bits of dust and debris through the fabric of his gloves. He came to a startling conclusion. This was decayed. He realized. The adults around him didn't say a word. That was, until Present Mike spoke up. How can you be so sure, little listener? The blonde questioned. Midoriya turned back to look at the group. It's the exact same texture compared to the metal I decayed during the entrance exam. The lingering smell matches up and everything. Nezu hummed, jumping straight to the point. Are you implying this is the work of a decay quirk, Midoriya? The boy turned back to the mangled barrier. His mind raced and yet drew up only one possible solution. Added with the information he had pieces together back in the classroom, and it painted a terrifying picture. That's exactly what I'm implying.